Friedrich Nietzsche did not begin as a philosopher who would hand you a tidy map of the world and a single, unambiguous doctrine to carry home in your pocket. He began as a restless young philologist who walked the campus with a scholar's eye for careful reading, a temperament that would later translate into a method that distrusts neat systems and privileges the life of ideas as it unfolds through language, culture, and history. Born in 1844 in the small German town of Rurken, Nietzsche entered Bonn at 18 with a scholar's hunger and a flirtation with philosophy that was soon tempered by a deep, almost painful engagement with classical philology. He moved quickly through the university streets of Bonn and Leipzig, where the air was thick with debates about Kant, Hegel, and the emerging currents of German idealism, and where the young man's own temperament found its first sharp edges. He was neither a conventional dogmatist nor a passive observer. He wanted to know how beliefs arise, how cultures discipline and delight themselves, and how a life could be lived with an artful seriousness that did not merely mirror the prevailing intellectual fashions. From the start, Nietzsche's life was shaped by a series of encounters with towering thinkers and disruptive episodes that would press him toward a method grounded in genealogy and historical critique rather than deductive system building. He absorbed Kant's critical spirit, the insistence that we must re-examine the conditions under which any knowledge or moral claim can stand, and he did not leave Kant behind so much as he attempted to test what a philosophy of limits would look like if it took seriously the power of interpretation itself. The Kantian question, how can we know what we know, lingered with Nietzsche not as a constraint to be overcome, but as a prompt to ask how values arise, how moral concepts get their persuasive force, and how a life must be oriented amid the pressure and creativity of history. Yet if Kant served as a compass, Nietzsche's own bearing soon shifted toward Schopenhauer's will and toward a broader, more daunting sense of culture. The way the will to life, without any comforting teleology, pushes organisms, peoples, and civilizations toward forms of expression that both sustain and threaten them. Schopenhauer enters Nietzsche's story not as an ally but as a provocateur. The younger philosopher is drawn to Schopenhauer's austere pessimism, the sense that life is entangled in a fundamental resistance to happiness and that the ground of appearances is a blind, inexorable will. This will, for Schopenhauer, is the thing that keeps the world in motion even as it shackles us with suffering. Nietzsche does not simply adopt this mood, he interrogates it with a more aggressive curiosity. He asks what it would mean to transform the will's stony energy into forms of culture that could life-affirm the very forces that seem to undermine us. If Schopenhauer gives him a vocabulary of negation, the sense that our desires exceed their objects and that longing often outstrips fulfillment, Nietzsche wants to know how to invert that dynamic into a form of life affirmation that does not drown in cynicism or resignation. In his early work, such tensions pulse at the center of his attempt to fuse art, philosophy, and practical life into an original project. That original project, for a long time, was wound around the cultural force of German idealism, the idea that the mind and the world are more entangled than common sense would admit, that the structure of experience and the structure of thinking shape the very objects we inhabit. Nietzsche is not an adherent of Hegelian absolute idealism, but he cannot escape the gravitational pull of that movement. The problem for him is not simply to reject it, but to resituate the drama of thinking within a more explosive, life-grounded frame. He wants to know how poetry, philosophy, and science together create a culture that makes certain values seem self-evident. The Greek world, and specifically the drama of tragedy, becomes his laboratory for thought. He returns again and again to the idea that culture should be judged not by its abstract rules or its capacity to systematize, but by its vitality, its capacity to face the dissolution of comforting certainties, and its willingness to risk transformation rather than stagnation. Then there is Greek tragedy, which Nietzsche treats as a crucial key for understanding how human beings inhabit the world. He reads the Greeks with unusual care, looking for a balance between Apollonian order, the steady, measured, lamplit forms of beauty, and Dionysian vitality, the wild, ecstatic, life-pouring force that dissolves boundaries and threatens to overwhelm the ordinary senses with intoxication. The Birth of Tragedy, his first major book, is a program that tries to reconcile two rival energies in the life of culture. It is also a bold wager that art, properly understood, can become a way of living with the world's deep ambiguities rather than denying them. The Apollonian and the Dionysian are not mere stylistic categories for Nietzsche. They are existential coordinates, one that promises control, form, and clarity, the other that insists on immersive immersion in chaos and ecstasy. The tension between them is not resolved in a final synthesis, but dramatized as a perpetual invitation to a more robust form of life. Wagner's music and persona occupy a central, volatile position in Nietzsche's life, a hinge upon which the trajectory of his thought swings decisively from the early to the late. Nietzsche first meets the famously dynamic composer around the mid-1860s, when he is a budding philologist with a taste for modern culture and a mind already moving toward the problem of how modern life should be evaluated. He sees in Wagner a living embodiment of the art that could fuse philosophy, music, and myth into something capable of rescuing Europe from spiritual exhaustion. This is not merely admiration. It is a shared sense that the arts could become a site of serious philosophical reflection, a laboratory for testing the claims of culture in real-life experience. The early Kunstkultur of Wagner's stagecraft becomes, for Nietzsche, a concrete example of how a culture constructs meaning, and thus a focal point for his developing method of critique. The Wagnerian moment is also a personal one, a friendship that intensifies into a dramatic romance between two ambitious minds, both of whom believe that culture can be reshaped from within. But as Nietzsche's philosophy forms, the Wagner friendship becomes a test case for the limits of admiration and the consequences of aesthetic devotion. The Case of Wagner, a long, analytic piece published in the 1888 period, is not simply an ethical or aesthetic critique. It is a methodological work in which Nietzsche tries to demonstrate that culture reveals its deepest loyalties, its vulnerabilities, and its political fantasies through art. The critique is not only about Wagner's music or personal failings, but about the way culture can be captured, manipulated, and sold as a life stance. In that sense, Wagner becomes a symbol of a broader project. To understand how a civilization makes sense of itself by rooting its values in a mythic narrative, and to show, with relentless clarity, the risks involved when art becomes a sovereign authority rather than a critical partner of life. The friendship's arc from enthusiasm to rupture offers a dramatic living example of Nietzsche's methodological commitments. He does not simply condemn, he dissects, traces origins, and shows how a powerful personality and a powerful art can shape the horizon of a whole era. The later Nietzsche, the thinker who writes the birth of tragedy and then moves through human, all too human, the dawn, thus spoke Zarathustra, beyond good and evil, and on the genealogy of morality, develops a turn away from large systematic treatises toward a different, more insurgent way of writing. The shift is not a rejection of depth or rigor, but a reconfiguration of how philosophy is done. The older model of a grand, deductive system gives way to a style that is, in a telling phrase, aphoristic. This is not merely a stylistic preference. It reflects a crucial methodological decision. Nietzsche adopts genealogical critique as his primary instrument, an approach that seeks origins, motives, and the historical processes by which values acquire their authority. The genealogical method asks not what is true in a universal sense, but how a culture comes to believe something, how those beliefs serve particular life-promoting or life-denying ends, and how they can be overturned or reinterpreted in the present. In practice, this means a lot of what Nietzsche writes is a where did this come from kind of analysis. He digs into the family of ideas that make up morality, religion, culture, and art, exposing the often messy, historically contingent genealogies that give rise to what we call truths. He insists that to understand a belief is to understand its function within a life, not merely to assess whether it is justified on a universal scale. This is where he brings in language and history as central to philosophy. The words we use, the stories we tell, the myths we reverence, they do not simply express our inner states. They actively shape what we can desire, what we fear, what we celebrate, and what we endure. The life of ideas in this sense is not a spectator sport. It is a field of power and vitality, and Nietzsche treats it as such. From a methodological perspective, The Birth of Tragedy becomes a kind of preface to a second epoch of Nietzsche's career. In that early work, he is already gesturing toward the problem of how to think about culture in a way that does not collapse into superstition or cynicism. He argues for a music and poetry-based, life-affirming approach to culture, an attempt to produce a form of art that can carry the weight of human suffering without dissolving into despair. The program is audacious. It seeks to recast the moral and aesthetic energy of a civilization as something that could be reordered in the service of life, rather than in the service of political or religious orthodoxies. The Birth of Tragedy is thus a kind of blueprint, not a set of conclusions. It is a call to experiment with the deepest energies of human expression, to test whether art can signpost a way beyond the binary of enlightenment, reason, and romantic exaltation. The Case of Wagner offers a complementary methodological demonstration. It shows how a taste for the sensational, even the sensationalist, can serve as a lens to reveal something essential about culture and about the life of art. Nietzsche's critique of Wagner is not an offhand dismissal of a composer. It is a rigorous study of what Wagner's art and his persona reveal about a culture's deepest commitments. In particular, Nietzsche is concerned with how a powerful art form can become a vehicle for manipulation, a means to produce the impression that life is meaningful and unified, when in fact it may be hollowed out by national myths, personal vanity, or dogmatic ideology. Through this critique, Nietzsche demonstrates the power and danger of placing a single art or a single figure at the center of a civilization's self-understanding. The case of Wagner thus serves as a methodological exemplar. It shows how to read a cultural field closely, paying attention to effect, rhetoric, public function, and hidden incentives, while remaining suspicious of any claim that art is merely a transparent window onto truth. As Nietzsche's own life unfolds, he becomes a living demonstration of the very tensions his philosophy wants to explore. There are moments when the vigor of his Basel lectures and his early scholarly productivity seem to radiate a sense of intellectual purpose and communal energy. He is intensely engaged with colleagues, students, and the city's cultural life, and his Basel years are marked by a kind of intellectual buzzing that feels almost electric. His teaching, though curtailed by health problems later on, is a sustained, four-stem of philology and philosophy, in which the discipline of text analysis becomes a way of understanding life itself. His intense Basel career, an era where he is constantly negotiating with colleagues, a city that becomes a laboratory for the living of ideas, illustrates a crucial point. Philosophy is not a solitary activity conducted in a silent room. It is performed in the street, in the lecture hall, in the print shop, in the conversations that ripple through a university and beyond. The Wagner-Nietzsche friendship marks another dramatic hinge in Nietzsche's life. It is the romance of two minds that saw culture as a battlefield of values, a laboratory for the testing of civilizational ideals, and a shared conviction that modern life required a radical reimagining of what art could be and do. The rupture, when it comes, is not a mere personal quarrel but a public philosophical crisis. It exposes the fragility and the risk of letting one figure define a culture's horizon and one vision of art hold the entire stage. The drama of their end, Wagner's triumphalism around his own role in modern culture and Nietzsche's growing suspicion of mythic nationalism, offers a window into Nietzsche's relentless insistence that beliefs must be judged not by sentiment or loyalty, but by their consequences for living and thinking in the present. The rupture is also a cautionary tale about how easily a life of ideas can become entangled with the life of a personality, and how the ethical task of philosophy is to stay attentive to the way such entanglements shape not just art, but the entire moral imagination of a people. Then comes the famous medical and psychological unraveling of 1889, a collapse that sent Nietzsche into a long period of illness and isolation. The exact reasons for this collapse remain debated. Some point to syphilis, others to a degenerative brain disease, or to a culmination of frailties that had been accumulating for years. What is clear is that the collapse did not terminate Nietzsche's philosophical output, it redirected it. He was no longer able to participate in the public life of the university and the cultural debates of his time, but his writings acquired a new intensity as he deepened his reflections on life, value, power, and interpretation. The posthumous shaping of his legacy, under Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, adds another layer of historical irony to his biographical arc. Elisabeth curated and edited her brother's papers in ways that served a certain political agenda, and thereby helped enable misreadings that would later be exploited by various ideological movements. The drama of that period reveals a truth about philosophy that Nietzsche himself would have anticipated. Ideas do not travel alone. They travel with editors, publishers, biographers, and the cultural weather that accompanies their publication. The afterlife of a life's work is always, in some sense, a new field of interpretation where old ideas can be rearranged, softened, or weaponized by later audiences. To understand Nietzsche's life and method is to see how these episodes converge into a single methodological project, a move from the plan of a grand systematic philosophy to a practice of historical critique, a practice that treats the life of an idea as the primary object of philosophical attention. The Birth of Tragedy's attempt to marry Apollonian order with Dionysian vitality is not a quaint historic curiosity, but a living invitation to see how civilizations negotiate a fundamental paradox. How to honor reason and form while not surrendering to a mechanized, lifeless rationalism that denies the fullness of human experience. The case of Wagner, likewise, is not merely about personal taste in music, but a demonstration of the power of culture to organize collective belief and aesthetic practice, and of how a modern personality can wield art as a political tool without fully naming its instrumentality. These episodes, Basel's intellectual buzz, the Wagner friendship and rupture, the 1889 collapse, and the contested legacy, are not footnotes to Nietzsche's philosophy. They are the living context that makes his later aphoristic writings intelligible as a form of life politics rather than a closed system of doctrine. In this light, the birth of tragedy and the later works appear less as contradictory stages in a single career and more as a continuous experiment with form, method, and purpose. The birth of tragedy is a manifesto, a bold claim about how culture could be revitalized by attending to the deepest energies of art. It is a program that seeks to reconceive art as life-affirming, capable of holding together the raw vitality of the Dionysian with the disciplined beauty of the Apollonian. It is not simply a theory of Greek drama, it is a theory of civilization's possible self-understanding. The later works, with their shift to aphorism and genealogy, are a refinement of that same aim in a new key. To show how our beliefs, fears, and desires have historical roots and how reimagining them could reconfigure how we live. Nietzsche's method becomes a way of doing philosophy that refuses to pretend that a single schema can capture the totality of human life. Instead, it asks readers to look at life's texture, its languages, its power relations, its historical contingencies, and to learn to read the world as a field of interpretive struggle in which we are always, to some degree, implicated and responsible. To see how this method works in practice, we can turn to the broader philosophical conversation that Nietzsche enters and, in important ways, helps to reframe. The genealogical approach is in dialogue with Kant's moral philosophy and with Schopenhauer's pessimism, but it moves beyond their horizons by insisting that the moral life is not a fixed product of rational justification, but a dynamic, historically evolving practice. Kant's project, after all, was to articulate a universal law of morality, grounded in reason and autonomy, that could universalize human dignity. Nietzsche asks what happens when that universalism is inseparable from particular histories, cultural pressures, and life forms that seduce us into moral commitments that serve concrete power structures rather than universal justice. He pushes toward a critique of moral sentiment by examining the historical origins of moral concepts, humility, guilt, duty, and showing how they may be reinterpreted as life-promoting or life-depleting in different contexts. The result is a philosophy that is not simply critical but constructive in its insistence that values are fights over meaning, and that the way we evaluate life reveals as much about our own desires as about any objective truth. If we bring in the Greek tracings, the Aristotle of tragedy and the Poetics, we get a richer sense of the stakes in Nietzsche's thought. Aristotle treats tragedy as a vehicle for catharsis, a structured, moving representation of human conflict that educates and purifies energy within the audience. Nietzsche, in turn, sees in tragedy not only catharsis, but a form of life that can teach us how to endure and transform pain. The dance of the gods in tragedy mirrors the dance of human beings towards self-overcoming, a theme that comes to a sharper focus in Nietzsche's own later claims about mastery, vitality, and authenticity. The link to Heraclitus, already present in the sense of flux and becoming, highlights Nietzsche's commitment to a dynamic cosmos in which oppositions are not simply reconciled, but continually reinterpreted through new perspectives and creative uses of language. This is also where the cross-reference to later interpretive frameworks becomes essential. Think of Kaufmann's interpretive role in shaping how 20th century readers encountered Nietzsche. Kaufmann's translations and introductions helped anchor Nietzsche within existentialist and phenomenological currents, even as Nietzsche's own work defies easy subsumption into any single philosophical program. Yet if Kaufmann opened doors, Deleuze and Foucault would take Nietzsche into terrains that the German philosopher could scarcely have imagined in full. Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche emphasizes difference, becoming, and the critique of identity politics as they arise in a world of power relations. For Deleuze, Nietzsche provides a vocabulary for thinking in terms of life as strength and invention, a way to resist the stagnation of conventional moralities without falling into nihilism. Foucault's genealogical method, reading history as a field of power relations, discourses, and institutions that shape what counts as truth, has a direct echo in Nietzsche's own insistence that the history of morals conditions what we deem rational or humane. The point here is not to claim that Nietzsche is a precursor to these later thinkers in a linear sense, but to highlight how his insistence on reading history, language, and life as unified fields of contest becomes a necessary ballast for later critiques of power, knowledge, and subjectivity. The practical and live dimension of Nietzsche's thought, the way his ideas might inform a contemporary reader's life, rests on several concrete application lines. One line concerns the critique of herd morality and the call for life-affirming, self-overcoming values. Nietzsche's idea that the weak impose constraints to preserve themselves, and that the strong might seek to convert these restraints into a more life-enhancing form of value, invites us to ask, what counts as life-affirming in our time? How do modern institutions, education, media, corporate structures, political ideologies, shape what we consider good, meaningful, or valuable? A second line concerns the reconstruction of individuality in an age of social pressures toward conformity. Nietzsche's emphasis on the importance of creating one's own ethos, his suspicion of unexamined belief, and his anxiety about what he calls the herd, offers a provocative framework for people seeking authentic direction in a world saturated by external incentives. A third line involves art and culture, Nietzsche's reverence for art as a potential form of life affirmation, and his insistence that art should not be reducible to ideology, can be invoked in debates about the role of culture in education, politics, and private life. The question of what art should do and how it should relate to truth and power remains remarkably alive in contemporary discourse. A few contemporary interpretive directions illuminate why Nietzsche continues to be a reference point for thinkers and writers in modern intellectual culture. One major thread is existential and humanist in spirit, emphasizing the obligation to create meaning in a world where traditional guarantees have fallen away. In this reading, the aphoristic voice is not a rhetorical escape hatch, but a way to mobilize the reader toward a life of deliberate self-formation, risk, and responsibility. Another thread is post-structural or postmodern, in which Nietzsche's suspicion of universalizable claims and his emphasis on language and interpretation become a provocation to reframe truth as a contested set of narratives with political consequences. A third thread involves political philosophy, where Nietzsche's radical critique of morality is used with caution and critical awareness to challenge dogmatic ideological formations while also recognizing how dangerous misreadings can be when principles are weaponized or essentialized. The danger of misreading is not merely an intellectual error, it is also an ethical hazard, because Nietzsche's thought invites us to recognize and resist the seductive power of simple, all-encompassing stories, even as it invites us to tell our own life-affirming, risk-embracing stories. The quotations that surface in Nietzsche's prose, moments where the text seems to crystallize a larger intuition, often function as signposts that guide readers through the complexity of his argument. Consider the stark and urgent assertion that God is dead, paired with the unsettling implication that humanity must assume responsibility for its own values in the wake of that death. The line, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him," is not merely a sensational proclamation. It is a diagnosis of a cultural shift in which old frameworks lose their power to authorize life, and in which new, self-authored forms of meaning must be discovered or created. The metaphor of life-affirming energy is tested in the infamous maxim about whether the will to power is a driver of human life and creative endeavor, a theme that recurs even in moments of critique and self-critique in Nietzsche's later work. The image of the abyss and the warning that, if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you, is a reminder that confronting the deepest, darkest aspects of existence is not an epistemic exercise alone. It is an existential formation that can transform one's character and life. In this light, Nietzsche's work is, paradoxically, a guide to courage to live with questions that do not submit to easy solutions and to bear the responsibility of shaping one's own values in a world without guaranteed meaning. It is also important to address the counterarguments against Nietzsche's method and project, as these counterarguments illuminate key tensions that remain crucial to any serious engagement with his philosophy. The first critique concerns the absence of a single, comprehensive system. Critics argue that if Nietzsche does not offer a unifying architecture, his philosophy risks incoherence, ambiguity, or a lack of practical guidance for living a stable moral life. This worry is not merely about logical completeness. It is about whether a philosophy can sustain a life under pressure when faced with real-world dilemmas that demand clear commitments. The second critique is about the risk of selective quotation and misreading in aphoristic writing. Because Nietzsche often writes in compact, provocative bursts, there is a danger that readers will cherry-pick sentences to support predetermined political, religious, or ideological leanings, rather than engage with the broader, more uncertain texture of his arguments. The risk of misreading is heightened by the fact that Nietzsche's own notes and publications, published posthumously or edited by others, sometimes present his ideas in contested forms. Both critiques point to a central challenge of Nietzschean philosophy: how to read without coercing the text into a fixed party-line interpretation while still respecting the radical call to reevaluate values and to test life by one's own standards. Another important historical and methodological point is the potential for misinterpretation to obscure the ethical stakes of Nietzsche's project. The risk is that readers will take him as an anti-moral purist whose insistence on life affirmation simply means a rejection of all normative claims. In reality, Nietzsche's critics' eye falls not on the erasure of values, but on their reconstitution in the service of a more intensive, more creative, more responsible life. He challenges us to examine the hidden incentives behind our moral judgments and to recognize how belief systems can slow or distort the human capacity for growth. He demands, in other words, that we become craftspersons of our own lives, selecting, shaping, and sometimes breaking the tools we use to live. The real danger is thus not the existence of competing systems, but the unexamined acceptance of any system as final. In Nietzsche's world, the most radical form of life is the one that refuses to concede that certainty has already been achieved, and that asks, instead, for perpetual recreation, recalibration, and humility before the complexity of experience. To return to the practical implications of his approach for education, culture, and everyday life, Nietzsche's insistence on the genealogy of values invites us to teach students not merely to memorize moral rules, but to examine the historical origins, the rhetorical functions, and the human costs attached to those rules. It asks teachers to cultivate an atmosphere in which students learn to ask why a given belief matters, for whom it matters, and what life it makes possible or impossible. In culture, Nietzsche's method encourages artists, writers, philosophers, and critics to look beneath the surface of fashion and authority, and to consider the historical conditions that give rise to particular forms of expression. Why did a certain myth become seductive at a certain historical moment? What social or political needs does it appear to satisfy? What alternative stories could replace it if life were to be reorganized around different values? The answers to these questions often require a patient willingness to trace lines of influence across time and space, to cross-reference Kant and Heraclitus, to see how Aristotle's understanding of tragedy resonates with Nietzsche's critique of modern culture, to read Wagner as both a mirror and a warning, to connect Nietzsche's genealogical method with Foucault's historical inquiries, and to lose conceptions of becoming. Let us move toward a few concrete, vivid moments from Nietzsche's life that illustrate the life of thought as a continuous drama rather than a set of abstract propositions. One historical anecdote concerns his Basel years and the intensity of intellectual buzzing in that city. Nietzsche's role as a professor of philology placed him at a crossroads where the humanities and the sciences of life, biology, psychology, anthropology, began to inflect each other in new ways. Basel offered him a public platform from which to engage in debates about the meaning of culture, the role of the university in a modern world, and the relation between art and truth. There is something telling in the energy of those years. The lectures, the coffeehouse discussions, the late-night conversations that would echo through the corridors and into his later writings. The Basel period demonstrated that philosophy is not an isolated discipline, but an ongoing conversation with the world, a conversation in which the stakes are not only truth, but the very possibility of living with integrity in a rapidly changing society. Another historical anecdote centers on the Wagner-Nietzsche friendship and its rupture. The two men shared a sensibility about the value of art in the modern world, a belief in the transformative potential of artistic culture, and a shared suspicion of the reigning German nationalism of their day. Yet their alliance could not endure the political and personal pressures that rose around them. Nietzsche's disillusionment with Wagner's attempts to reconfigure art into a state-building project was swift and devastating, and the rupture itself was a dramatic, public demonstration of Nietzsche's refusal to give ground on fundamental questions of truth, power, and life without rigorous critique. This is a vivid demonstration of Nietzsche's method in action. It is not enough to admire or even to condemn. One must analyze, diagnose, and articulate what a cultural project claims to be, how it functions, and what it discloses about the life it seeks to sustain. Finally, the 1889 collapse, the event that would shape the rest of Nietzsche's life and the reception of his philosophy, shows how a thinker's body and mind can become entangled with the production and reception of ideas in ways that are both tragic and illuminating. The collapse did not end Nietzsche's work, it redirected it, and in the years that followed, his posthumously published writings would become the subject of intense interpretive debates, catalyzed by Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche's editing and display of her brother's manuscripts. The story of that editing and of the later appropriation of Nietzsche's ideas by various political movements raises crucial questions about how philosophical legacies are curated, misread, used, and sometimes abused. It invites readers and viewers to examine not only Nietzsche's texts but the historical life of those texts, who controls their dissemination, how they are framed, and what kinds of political and intellectual winds shape their reception in different epochs. If we turn now to the core, central claims of Nietzsche's life, method, and ground, The aim is not to produce a mere chronological recital, but to illuminate how the biographical facts and the historical contexts illuminate the tension between a life devoted to the critique of culture and a theory that seeks to reimagine what culture itself could be. The biographical episodes, the Basel lectures, the Wagner friendship and rupture, the dramatic 1889 collapse, and the posthumous shaping of his legacy, are not simply backdrop. They are essential elements of the philosophical argument Nietzsche is making, that life cannot be reduced to a set of universal laws, that values are created and contested inside particular communities and moments, and that to think truly is to be willing to revalue what counts as meaningful living over and over in response to the changing weather of history. It is the life of the mind as it wrestles with the fact that the world is not the way we would wish it to be, and the moral task is not to pretend that it is, but to learn how to live with what it is, while still cultivating the courage and imagination to reimagine what it might become. As we move toward a closing reflection for this section, let us consider the larger arc of Nietzsche's life as a continuous invitation to engage with the world's deepest questions in a manner that is both rigorous and supple. He asks us to question the almost unquestioned certainties that hold together our sense of self and our sense of what the world must be. He requests that we interrogate the sources of our values, not merely to dethrone them, but to discover how a more vibrant life could emerge when we reframe the foundations of meaning. The journey from the young philologist on Bond streets to the Basel professor who could change the mood of a continent is, in this sense, a story about intellectual courage and moral imagination as much as about textual criticism or philosophical doctrine. It is a story about how a thinker, moved by an acute awareness of life's fragility and potential, seeks to fuse the life of the mind with the life of the world, how to think and how to live in a way that respects the complexity of both. To bring this to a close by returning to the primary pages that anchored Nietzsche's own life, we can hear again the voltaic force of his voice when he speaks to us across the centuries. God is dead, we have killed him. The burden now falls on us to craft values that can sustain the risk, the beauty, and the terror of living. That is the audacious horizon Nietzsche opens, not as a doctrine, but as an invitation to perpetual question and creation. He writes not as a dogmatist, but as a craftsman of life, a reader of history who refuses to surrender to despair or to the complacent certainties of any era. He writes in a language of images, provocations, and precise observations that demand not just to be heard, but to be tested by life itself. The Birth of Tragedy remains a bold wager about art's capacity to hold contradiction, to generate a form of culture that can resist cynical nihilism while staying honest about human longing. The case of Wagner, with its insistence on the political and social implications of artistic life, remains a methodological exemplar of how to read a culture in the act of making itself. And the later works, written in the shadows of illness, offer a different form of clarity, an insistence that to live well is to ask for more, to test the limits of what we can bear, to seek not universal prescriptions but intensities of life that push us toward future possibilities we have not yet named. If you take one thing away from the biographical and methodological map we have sketched here, it is this: Nietzsche's philosophy is inseparable from his life. His life is inseparable from his method. And his method, genealogy, history, language, life, remains, for many readers, the most compelling instrument for approaching the questions that matter. What is good? What is valuable? How should we live? And why should we care enough to live it at all? The answers he offers are not tidy. They are not simply rational justifications for a fixed creed. They are radical questions about freedom, responsibility, and the courage to interpret one's life in the face of a history that often resists interpretation. The cross-referencing with Kant, Schopenhauer, Heraclitus, Aristotle, and the later interpreters is not a parade of influences, but a map of the conversation that Nietzsche himself both enters and helps to transform. And if we read him with care, we discover in his life and in his method a persistent invitation to think with our whole being, to ask, to doubt, to reimagine, and in doing so, to become capable of living in a way that makes the world both intelligible and more alive. Close your eyes for a moment and listen not to the internal hum of your own mind, but to a line of thought that has haunted philosophy with its restless energy for more than a century. It asks not for final answers, but for a way of asking questions that does not pretend to lay down the last word. Nietzsche invites us to imagine a life that does not flatter the hunger for certainty, but rather nourishes the will to power, to growth, to self-rule, to the continuous reformation of values. In this section, we will trace the core pillars that Nietzsche threads together: the will to power, the eternal recurrence, perspectivism, and the figure of the Ubermench, and we will watch how they interlock to form a philosophy that is at once audacious, seductive, and disquieting. We will anchor these ideas in the principal texts, the gay science, beyond good and evil, thus spoke Zarathustra and the Antichrist, and we will listen to the echoes of Nietzsche in the historical conversations that preceded him and that followed him. We will hear the dialogue with other thinkers who illuminate his claims and challenge them, from Schopenhauer to Bergson, from Aristotle to Kierkegaard, and down to Foucault and Sartre, who would later re-enter Nietzsche's house with new keys. Let us begin with the will to power, the dynamism Nietzsche treats as the substrate of life itself. The will to power is not a simple appetite for domination over others, though power can be one surface expression of it. It is better to say that Nietzsche glimpses power as the driving force behind all striving, a driving force that seeks to exercise, expand, intensify, and reconfigure power, not merely as control over others, but as mastery over fortune, circumstance, and one's own soul. It is a life-affirming motion, a form of becoming that pushes against stagnation, against the idea that there is a fixed end state for any being. The will to power is the engine of interpretation as well as the engine of action. It shapes how we endure pain, how we pursue joy, and how we create meaning in a world that does not hand it to us. This is not a metaphysical dogma, at least not in a simple sense. Nietzsche often stages the will to power as both metaphysical wager and methodological lens. It is the force behind existential energy and the condition under which meaning can arise. The will to power becomes visible in the way organisms respond to constraints, in the way communities erupt into ambitious projects, in the manner a person reframes a fear into a source of creative energy. The will to power welcomes anxiety as a catalyst, not as a verdict. It is a grammar of life that refuses a passive surrender to conditions, insisting instead that we attend to our own capacity to revalue and to recreate ourselves. To ground this with text and texture, we can move into the gay science, where the mood is one of illumination after a long dusk. The famous proclamation that often appears in the wake of his critique of Christianity is the stark, disorienting sentence: "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." This is not a celebration of atheism as a mere denial, but a diagnosis. The moral horizons that once gave life its unity have dissolved, leaving humanity to reimagine its own powers. In the wake of such a rupture, the will to power emerges as a practical response, a way of living in the absence of a preordained structure. The cosmos does not hand us a teleology. We must craft purposes through our own strength, through the creation of values that enable life to flourish. The will to power, then, is not simply a repudiation of transcendent authority. It is an invitation to a strenuous, disciplined form of life that refuses to be defined by fear, dogma, or fatigue. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche sharpens this account by pushing the indictment of conventional morality further. He asks what counts as good and what counts as evil, and he answers with a provocative, disturbing clarity: what is good? All that heightens the feeling of power in the individual, and what is evil? All that proceeds from weakness. Here the will to power becomes a criterion for moral evaluation, but it is a criterion that unsettles any inherited moral authority that presumes universality. The point is not to celebrate power as raw domination, but to insist that moral claims must be tested against the vitality, strength, and flourishing of life. When Nietzsche writes that, "what is good?" all that heightens the feeling of power and all that increases the feeling of power in the doer, he is challenging moralists to consider what their judgments genuinely support: life and vitality, or resentment, fear, and stagnation. The will to power thus operates as a hermeneutic for ethics, a way of reading values to determine whether they empower living beings or imprison them in inert habits. We should consider the way this principle shows up in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra's rhetoric dramatizes a revolt against the leveling currents of herd morality. It is in Zarathustra's encounters, his nocturnal meditations, and his exhortations that the will to power becomes a creative force shaping new kinds of life. The most succinct and haunting line, often cited in translations, almost announces a horizon beyond conventional morality. Man is something that should be overcome. The phrase is stark and its effect is double. It jars us from complacency and invites us to imagine a form of humanity whose commitments are not shackled to the old order. The will to power, then, is not merely about political force or social domination. It is about a radical reappraisal of what counts as life, what counts as good, what counts as virtue, and what counts as ambition. In Zarathustra, the will to power becomes a guide toward becoming a new kind of being, a life capable of revaluing all values without surrendering to nihilism. Let's also hold the thread of the will to power in workaday scenes, everyday life, science, art, politics. The will to power is not only a macro claim about human grandeur, It is a micro-theory of how individuals and groups interpret, respond to, and reframe their environments. Nietzsche's language compels us to notice that explanatory power itself becomes a site of power. He asks us to observe that scientific theories, moral codes, religious creeds, and political systems are embodiments of will to power contoured by historical forces. When we insist on objectivity as if it were a neutral doorway to truth, we may be disguising a power constellation under the mask of certainty. Perspectivism emerges as a disciplined stance here. We should recognize that every account of truth is a vantage point, never the last word in a final, universal sense. This is not a call to cynicism or relativism as such, but a historically aware attentiveness to the way power shapes knowledge. The second pillar, the eternal recurrence, arrives as a rigorous thought experiment, a test that penetrates the heart of how one lives, loves, fears, and imagines the future. The eternal recurrence asks us to imagine that our life, in all its painful joy and precarious beauty, would have to be lived over and over again in exactly the same way for all time. The thought is not offered as an ontological claim that the cosmos actually repeats itself in a literal sense. It is offered as a practice of ascetic radicality that tests one's attitude to life. If the recurrence terrifies you, Nietzsche asks you to consider whether your life would be worth living if such a fate were your eternal fate. If it fills you with a sense of affirmation and a readiness to embrace every fault and every triumph, then you may have found a way to live that is worthy of the name life itself. The earliest full-formed artistic engagement with this idea appears most famously in the gay science, where the thought is presented as a way of testing one's attitude to existence. The line that travels across Nietzsche's pages is often rendered in translations as, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more." The effect in reading or hearing it is not simply to terrify or to thrill, it is to prompt a practical question. If I could live my life again, would I consent to the same choices, the same loves, the same hatreds, the same accomplishments, the same miseries? If yes, the thought offers a form of radical affirmation. If no, then the thought becomes a demand for a revaluation that would make such a life worthy of another round. Nietzsche writes not as a metaphysical theorist who asserts a cosmic loop, but as a moral psychologist who asks, what kind of life would I or we most deeply want to live if nothing was final and every moment could be recommenced? To see how the eternal recurrence works in practice, we turn to Zarathustra's teachings and to the way we imagine the self in response to the test. In the narrative, characters confront this recurrency and respond in ways that illuminate what Nietzsche thinks of courage, love, and freedom. The test presses us to see if we can affirm life in the face of its most onerous aspects, the decay of the body, the erosion of dreams, the memory of guilt, the sting of loss, and to do so with a stance that does not retreat into either resignation or hedonistic intoxication. The eternal recurrence, then, is not simply a cold metaphysical assertion, but a spiritual discipline, a way to shape temperament, to refine intention, to discipline the will. It amplifies responsibility. When you know that you must endure your choices forever, you are urged to make choices that are not merely expedient or convenient, but ones that utterly animate your being and align with a life-affirming ethos. Next, perspectivism. Nietzsche's insistence on perspectivism is a disciplined stance toward knowledge and truth that resists absolute certainty. The basic claim is that there are many ways to interpret the world, and no single viewpoint captures the whole truth. We see through forms of life, through historical conditions, through linguistic languages, through power relations, through the labors and biases of our communities. The phrase that has become emblematic, whether precisely quoted or not in every translation, points to a methodological humility. Truth is not a single, unassailable tower, but a constellation of interpretations held together by their usefulness, vitality, and capacity to advance life. Perspectivism is not a license for caprice. It is a discipline that invites us to acknowledge our own boundaries, to challenge our own assumptions, to ask what power structures, what historical contingencies, what passions, what fears shape our beliefs. In the major texts, the thread appears with particular force in the Antichrist and in the critiques that run through the gay science and beyond good and evil. Nietzsche asks us to see science not as a neutral, disembodied enterprise, but as a historical project, embedded in a particular story about nature, about human beings, about progress. A scientist may claim objectivity in the sense of replicability or predictive success, but Nietzsche asks us to see the contingent assumptions that underwrite even such claims. The training, the vocabulary, the aims, the social incentives that direct what counts as a problem and how a problem is solved. Perspectivism, then, is a call to treat truth claims as historically situated. It is a call to resist the seduction of claiming finality when the ground on which such finality rests is shifting under the feet of inquiry. The ethical corollary is that knowledge becomes a form of power, and power must be examined in its ethical texture. This is where cross-references to other thinkers become especially fruitful. Spinoza's conatus, the striving inherent in every being to persevere in its existence, offers Nietzsche a genealogical resource for understanding how life emerges from struggle, how vitality organizes itself through resistance. But Nietzsche will critique the teleology and moral framing of Aristotelian virtue ethics, where flourishing is defined by an end goal of the good life. Yet the critique can be read as a conversation with Aristotle. If virtue is about shaping one's own character to meet a challenging world, perhaps Nietzsche is insisting that we abandon the static idea of the good as a fixed teleology and instead cultivate a ferocious, flexible form of self-governance, a character capable of continual redefinition. Bergson's Elan Vital offers a different but resonant horizon, a moving, creative force that eludes rigid mechanistic accounts of life, yet echoes Nietzsche in its insistence that life is a dynamic flow rather than a frozen system of causes. Bergson's philosophy, with its emphasis on duration, novelty, and the spontaneity of life, helps to illuminate Nietzsche's sense that power and invention emerge from living time rather than from static abstractions. On the other side of the conversation, Kierkegaard's emphasis on subjectivity and the leap of faith speaks to the urgency with which Nietzsche treats the individual as the site of value creation, but Nietzsche flips the move. The leap is toward a revaluation of all values rather than toward a religious or teleological surrender. Kierkegaard's insistence on the primacy of personal resolution and the anxiety of freedom resonates with Nietzsche's own sense that truth is inseparable from an individual's life-creating commitments. In later reception, Foucault and Sartre are two who return Nietzsche to life as a problem of power and freedom. Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, his analysis of how discourses produce subjects and regimes of truth, echoes Nietzsche's perspectivism by showing how truth claims function as strategies of power within historical regimes. Sartre's existential emphasis on freedom and responsibility can be read as an intensification of Nietzsche's call to revalue values, but Sartre's own ethics and politics push toward a more explicit theory of universal responsibility, which Nietzsche often resists by insisting that there are no universals, only singular life forms and their power-laden interpretations. The dialogue does not produce a settled consensus, but it does produce a vibrant, sometimes contentious, conversation about the meaning of freedom, truth, and power. Let us also cast a few threads of historical anecdote to situate these ideas in a lived intellectual life. First, the early influence of Schopenhauer on Nietzsche's vocabulary and direction is not merely anecdotal, it is formative. Nietzsche begins in a mood shaped by Schopenhauer's analysis of the will as the thing in itself, and by the ethical mood of ascetic resignation that Schopenhauer sometimes condenses into an indictment of desire. The young Nietzsche inherits a vocabulary, the will, the impetus to persevere, the stubborn insistence that the world's appearances conceal something more fundamental, and then borrows the energy of pessimism but turns it toward life affirmation. The shift is not abrupt but dramatic, from the idea that the world is a representation of inexhaustible suffering to the idea that we can will to power beyond that suffering into a form of life that both embraces and overcomes its own limitations. The rupture with Wagner is the second vivid anecdote. Nietzsche's friendship with the composer Ludwig van Wagner begins with a shared sensibility for myth, art, and the Dionysian energies that Wagner's early music and writing seem to embody. Nietzsche admires Wagner's capacity to fuse music and myth into a transformative force. Yet the friendship sours as Nietzsche's critique of Christianity and of bourgeois morality deepens, and as his own aesthetic and philosophical vision becomes more radical. The rupture, which crystallizes in the late 1880s, is not simply about art or politics, but about power and the revaluation of values. Wagner's project, grand, mythic, redemptive, becomes in Nietzsche's hands a foil to an even more radical claim, that art and life must be reorganized so that power, vitality, and life-affirming force are allowed to flourish without settlement for mere consolation. The art that once seemed to promise salvation appears, in Nietzsche's later writings, as a form of intoxication that could distract from the harsh necessity of becoming. The rupture thereby becomes a pivot from a Dionysian unity toward a more radical, sometimes transgressive, proposition in the 1880s. The late shift, which unfolds in works such as Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and The Late Fragments, marks a movement toward a more uncompromising, transgressive stance. Nietzsche's voice grows sharper, more impatient with the sentimentalities of morality, more eager to press on uncomfortable questions, and more willing to risk alienating readers who cling to conventional norms. The late voice is difficult. It demands not only intellectual rigor but moral audacity. It asks whether the very project of civilization can endure without a bold revaluation of what counts as good and evil, and it invites you to imagine, are you willing to revaluate your own life in the face of a world that refuses to hand you any secure ground? The tone shifts toward a stark, almost archaic clarity, the call to live bravely, to affirm life with a fierce, unflinching integrity, to test one's own values against the possibility of their becoming life-affirming forms of power. Let us turn to the Ubermench, the aspirational figure that anchors Nietzsche's revaluation of values. The Ubermensch is not a robot of power, not a mere political tyrant, not an idol of domination, but a figure of mastery and self-fashioning who embodies a new kind of life, one that creates its own values, assumes responsibility for its own choices, and bears the burden of freedom with a quiet, uncomplaining courage. The figure appears most vividly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Nietzsche invites us to see the overman as the meaning of the earth. The overman stands at the horizon as both a goal and a call. A life that refuses the passive acceptance of given norms and boldly affirms its own inventive power. He or she does not merely possess strength. One learns to reconcile strength with beauty, power with responsibility, ambition with humility before the stubborn facts of existence. The overman is the practitioner of a revaluation, a recalibration of values that frees the human being from the shackles of old dogmas and opens space for new forms of life that are more vigorous, more creative, and more alive. And yet Nietzsche does not disentangle aesthetic life from scientific life in a simplistic way. He holds that the valuation of life must harmonize with a disciplined aesthetic sense and a relentless fidelity to facts. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the Ubermensch appears at once as a vision of artistic self-creation and as a critique of science that pretends to disinterested truth while hiding its own commitments. The elevation of life, the revaluation of free energy into the creation of values, cannot be achieved by a simplistic opposition to science. Rather, the critique must be one that insists on the seriousness of life, on the moral seriousness of what we choose to pursue, and on the risk inherent in any project that seeks to reimagine humanity's future. The Ubermensch in this sense is both a beacon and a burden, a standard by which we measure our own courage and a reminder of the heavy weight of freedom. The Antichrist sharpens the ethical and religious critique to a degree that makes many readers uncomfortable. Nietzsche here targets Christianity not as a mere set of dogmas, but as a comprehensive life-historic force that, in his view, has systematically inverted values, reinterpreted suffering as virtue, and treated life affirmation as dangerous or deviant. His language, often stark, sometimes incendiary, speaks of Christianity as a form of what he calls ressentiment, a revaluation from below that seeks to level differences and to domestic the raw energies of life. His polemic is not a simple rejection of piety. It is a demand for a reimagining of what counts as good, what counts as noble, and what counts as admirable in human life. The Antichrist invites us to see Christianity as part of a long historical struggle over power, meaning, and life. In this sense, the work is not only theological critique, but political and existential argument. If our most cherished ideals are undermined by the very life they claim to elevate, then the task is to construct a different kind of vitality, one that is more honest about pain, more fearless about desire, and more attentive to the complexity of power in a world without guarantees. Let us now consider two counterarguments and take them seriously within the texture of Nietzsche's thought. First, a debate about whether the will to power is a metaphysical principle or merely an interpretive heuristic. Some readers take the claim as a universal substrate of reality. Everything is in some sense an expression of a deeper power-seeking force. Others insist that it is a methodological lens, a way of reading phenomena that helps us see how power dynamics shape meaning without requiring that power be the essence of all things. The tension matters. If the will to power is merely a heuristic, critics might argue, then Nietzsche's system risks becoming a toolbox that can be used to rationalize every position, including those it aims to critique. If, on the other hand, the will to power is a metaphysical principle, then Nietzsche seems to insist we owe allegiance to a totalizing, perhaps even monistic, account of reality. The middle path is to see the will to power as an interpretive principle that, in its strongest form, becomes a testing ground for claims about life and value, while in its more modest readings it functions as a descriptive account of how power, risk, and vitality produce meaning in historical life. The important thing is to keep the tension alive. Power must be recognized as a dimension of life that can distort truth, and truth must be tested against life's flourishing, not the other way around. The second counterargument concerns the eternal recurrence. Is this literally metaphysical, or is it a rigorous methodological device? Some readers insist that the recurrence claims a cosmological totality, a literal repetition of events across time. Nietzsche, they argue, would be inadvertently prompting fatalism, or at least a deterministic picture of a universe that requires us to accept the exact same future on such an improbable scale. Others insist that the recurrence is a thought experiment designed to shape one's attitude toward responsibility and intensity of living. If the future is indeed uncertain for us, the thought experiment serves as a severe test. How would you live if you knew you would relive this life in every moment, infinite times? The strength of the latter reading is that it preserves Nietzsche's paradoxical freedom. The more you affirm life on such terms, the more you realize that you are the author of your fate in every sense that matters. The danger in treating recurrence as simple metaphysics is that it might become a dull, fatalistic sermon about inevitability. But treated as a demanding test, an exercise in radical responsibility, it becomes a moral flare that intensifies the present, turning every choice into a decision that carries existential weight for eternity. A third set of counterarguments concerns perspectivism and its destabilizing effect on objective critique. If every truth claim is just one perspective among many, then how can we condemn oppression, lies, or abuse? How can there be any robust critique of power, science, or ideology if all claims are simply contingent on vantage points? Nietzsche anticipates such concerns with the insight that perspectivism is not an invitation to irreconcilable relativism. It is a demand that we take seriously the conditions under which claims arise and the aims they serve. It means asking not only what is claimed, but who claims it, with what stakes, and to what ends. The risk, however, is that perspectivism can be used to destabilize critique to the point where every indictment loses its force, because the ground of validation is seen as historically contingent and contestable. Nietzsche's answer, if one must name one, would be to insist that life itself, its vigor, its vitality, its capacity for creative self-overcoming, remains the ultimate criterion. If a claim serves to empower life, to sharpen perception, to increase the strength of the will, it is a candidate for truth. If it dulls life's edge, narrows possibility, or anesthetizes courage, it should be suspect. The challenge is to keep this criterion alive without falling into cynicism about all claims. Now, let us walk through a few concrete examples to illuminate how these ideas function in practice and how they might look if we take them into the everyday world. First example, the will to power in Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil as a critique of conventional morality. In Zarathustra, we encounter a revolt against the moral codes that regulate life into sameness. The last man, comfortable, risk-averse, seeking only security and comfort, embodies a condition Nietzsche dislikes. The overman, by contrast, does not reject moral inquiry. Rather, he reconstructs it anew, grounding values in life, in energy, in the capacity to create rather than to obey. A key scene, though not a single neat scene, shows Zarathustra urging a recalibration of what counts as good, evil, and noble, not by appeal to absolutes, but by observing how moral judgments function as forms of power that discipline desire, channel fear, and shape social order. In Beyond Good and Evil, the critique of herd morality becomes sharper still. The book's famous passages insist that what has long counted as good and evil are often simply those qualities that sustain the standing of the powerful or the comfortable, while the weak have extracted a morality out of ressentiment, the moral feelings of those who feel themselves oppressed or left behind, who then invert the standard so that weakness becomes virtuous and strength becomes blameworthy. The will to power here is not a dressing of brute force onto ethical problems. It is an invitation to examine the source of values, to question who benefits from them, and to imagine a transformation that would reorient life toward its more enduring powers. Creativity, vitality, resilience, freedom. Second example, the eternal recurrence as a thought experiment that affects one's attitude to life and responsibility. The test is not a cruel cosmic punishment, but a moral instrument for sharpening one's commitments. If I would condemn a choice forever, if I had to relive it endlessly, my present decisions would carry extraordinary weight. If the answer is yes, if I would gladly endure the repetition, then I am aligning my life with a kind of stubborn affirmation that denies despair a veto over the future. Nietzsche's test, practiced in the imaginary or internal dialogue of a life, becomes a discipline for a life lived with resolve. It is not about annihilating risk or avoiding pain. It is about the way a life is chosen, the way a life carries itself, the manner in which one answers the demand to exist with courage and integrity in the face of the unknown. In Zarathustra, the dragon's breath of risk and the lion's heart of courage are not simply aesthetic archetypes. they are the moral energies required to shoulder the burden of freedom. The eternal recurrence, then, is the exercise by which one can calibrate whether one's life has become a work that one would choose to will again and again, a life that one can present as a form of self-creation rather than a surrender to circumstance. A third example concerns perspectivism applied to science and truth claims in Nietzsche's historical critique. The scientific enterprise for Nietzsche is not a neutral, disinterested climb toward universal facts. It is a human activity embedded in culture, language, and power. The scientist who claims an ultimate vantage is, in a sense, lying to himself about the constructed nature of his own frame, yet this does not render science worthless. Rather, it invites a more honest science, one that recognizes its own assumptions, its underlying metaphysical commitments, and the practical aims it serves. Nietzsche's historical critique shows that even the most celebrated phrasings of truth are in fact interpretive strategies that gain authority because they fit the life worlds of a culture. This does not entail a pure relativism, it entails a disciplined humility. It asks for a continual re-examination of methods, hypotheses, and purposes, and a constant attention to how power, status, and social forms shape what counts as evidence and what counts as worth believing. The cross-reference to Spinoza's conatus here is instructive. There is a continuity in insisting that life strives to persist, yet Nietzsche's perspectivism stretches the analysis further by insisting that the ways in which we interpret that striving are themselves historically conditioned and morally significant. Bergson's élan vital, with its focus on dynamism and novelty, resonates here as a partner in the sense that life's creative forces resist being captured by static theories. The challenge it poses to a pure mechanistic account likewise pushes the reader to imagine knowledge as an active, evolving formation rather than a finished product. As we move toward a closing reflection, we should not forget the moral breadth and historical texture of Nietzsche's project. He writes not only to unsettle our comfortable certainties, but to call for a life that is more intense, more honest, more courageous, and more creative. The call to risk and experiment is not a stamp of nihilism. It is a demand that we align our desires with our responsibilities to life and to others who inhabit it with us. Nietzsche's philosophy asks us to become co-authors of our lives, to resist the seduction of complacency, and to face the possibility that what we call the good might itself be a practice of power that must be reimagined so as to cultivate genuine vitality. In closing, I want to invite you to think of Nietzsche's core pillars not as a system that prescribes a single path, but as a language for thinking about life's most stubborn questions. The will to power is not a simple tally of dominance. It is a grammar for understanding how life asserts itself, transforms adversity into energy, and sculpts meaning through acts of creation. The eternal recurrence is not an article of faith about an eternal cosmos. It is a method for weighing our choices, demanding courage, and insisting that a life worth living would be one we would choose to repeat forever. Perspectivism is not an invitation to cynicism about truth. It is a discipline that teaches us to examine the premises that give us knowledge and to understand how power shapes those premises. The Ubermench is not the law of an unbridled will. It is the image of a life that learns to bear responsibility for its own revaluation of values, a life that stands at the edge of ancient patterns and dares to leap into new forms of beauty and power. The Antichrist is not a mere anti-Christian polemic. It is a radical challenge to reorient meaning toward life itself, toward the richness and risk and necessity of existence. Across these strands, Nietzsche offers a vision of philosophy that binds aesthetic judgment, critical inquiry, and moral seriousness into a single, unyielding demand. That we live with intention, that we think with courage, and that we dare to reimagine what counts as life, and thus as human flourishing, in a world that refuses to supply us with a definitive map. If we listen closely to the conversation Nietzsche invites us into, across the gay science, beyond good and evil, thus spoke Zarathustra and the Antichrist, we hear something both ancient and explosive. A call to become, to create, to endure, and to love the precarious grandeur of living. We hear the echo of Schopenhauer, the rupture with Wagner, the shift of the 1880s toward more radical proposals. We hear the echoes too of Spinoza, Bergson, Aristotle, Kierkegaard, Foucault, Sartre, thinkers who illuminate different corners of the same labyrinth, who remind us that power, truth, and freedom are never neutral, that philosophy is always a practice, and that a life worth living demands more from us than mere assent to comforting assumptions. In that sense, Nietzsche remains not so much a system builder as a provocateur of living thought, a relentless reminder that even the most difficult questions deserve a patient, careful listening, a careful testing of our own boundaries, and a willingness to be remade again and again by what we learn to love as truth. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast moral landscape, where the terrain has grown strange and unfamiliar, where old hills and valleys that once guided travelers no longer hold their shape. This is the terrain Nietzsche wants us to navigate in the section we're exploring today. The revaluation of values, the death of God, the crisis of nihilism, the ascetic ideal, and the master-slave morality that, in his telling, underwrites much of Western ethics. It's not a celebration, it's a diagnosis. It's not merely polemic. It's a form of philosophical anatomy, a careful map of where moral life has frayed, why it has frayed, and how life might be regrounded on different terms, terms that affirm life rather than deny it. Let us begin with the birth of the diagnosis, which Nietzsche locates not in a single religious blare or a sudden political shock, but as a cultural event, a turning of the wheel in which the very ground of value is unsettled. In the gay science, the famous sentence "God is dead" does not arrive as a triumphant banner, but as a sober, unsettling notice. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. The phrase is stark, almost clinical in its bluntness, and yet its resonance is moral and existential rather than merely theological. It marks a collapse at the heart of the highest authority by which Europe, and by extension much of the modern world, has measured meaning. The metaphysical scaffold, the eternal judge, the universal sanction, gone, or at least gone as a guarantor of the old ways of living. The human being is left in a sunlight without a temple, a field without a shepherd. The moral cosmos does not vanish into nothingness in Nietzsche's telling, it trembles and reconstitutes itself. The crisis calls forth two possibilities. Either we descend into a new form of nihilism, where all values dissolve into powerlessness, or we rise to fashion a life-affirming revaluation, a recrafting of values that does not pretend the world is effortless or painless, but nonetheless makes life worth living with freedom and courage. The account of nihilism is not merely a scare story about what happens when belief fades. Nietzsche presents nihilism as a cultural condition, a scale of valuation that loses its source of meaning and hesitates at the edge of a void. Nihilism in his telling has deeper roots than mere atheism. It is tied to a historical assessment of what counts as good and what counts as evil. It reveals how values come to be, not as neutral observations but as outcomes of power, of human beings negotiating who has the capacity to label, to condemn, to reward. This is where the genealogical method enters with its sharper edge. In the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche turns moral history into a courtroom drama in which the verdicts of good and evil are not eternal truths but social productions, over time contested by different parties with rival interests and different kinds of strength. The first major stroke of this genealogy is the master-slave morality contrast, the story of how good and bad are resorted through the eyes of the powerful and the resentful. We should pause to hear Nietzsche's logic as he unfolds it. The master morality begins with those who see themselves as noble, not in the sense of a technical rule book of virtue, but in terms of power, vitality, and self-affirmation. The good is what the powerful call good because it aligns with their vigor, their success, their capacity to impose their own standards. The bad, then, is the label given to what the masters disdain, everything that undercuts their command or questions their dominance. Contrast this with slave morality, which emerges in response to oppression, in response to the ressentiment that simmers in those who cannot openly exercise power. Ressentiment is not simply anger. It is a psychic and moral energy that seeks to invert values. What the master calls good, the slave calls evil. What the master calls bad, exploitation, domination, the slave rebrands as good because it serves the fortification of weakness against power by turning power's terms upside down. The slave revolt in morals, Nietzsche writes, begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative. The moral vocabulary grows new teeth. The good becomes the evil that is tolerated or celebrated by those with lesser sway who now congratulate themselves for their moral superiority over their former masters. This is not a mere condemnation of Christian ethics, though Nietzsche makes that move with great force. The critique of Christianity and the ascetic ideal is the most sustained part of his claim that modern life has been haunted by life-denying values. The ascetic ideal, we should understand, is not a single creed but a family of practices and dispositions that share a common stance. The denial of life in some form, the withholding of instinctual flourishing, the valorization of restraint, self-denial, and pain as a form of moral or spiritual currency. Priests, philosophers, scientists, and artists, the spectrum is broad, become its carriers at different historical junctures, each using the ascetic posture to interpret suffering, to discipline the will, to claim authority over others, or to justify a particular worldview. Nietzsche's startling claim is that the ascetic ideal does not emerge merely from religious zeal or from a Christian zeal for guilt. It arises as a pervasive temperament within culture, a valuation of the body's desires as dangerous or blameworthy, and a redefinition of life's purpose through the lens of sacrifice, punishment, and guilt. The critique of Christian ethics, in particular, is not merely about condemning a set of rules or a doctrine of morality. It is about the psychology of moral feeling and the social logic that makes certain kinds of life, namely, life under constraint, life submitted to a transcendent law, more prestigious than other forms of life. In Nietzsche's account, Christian morality valorizes humility, renunciation, self-denial, the suppression of instinct, and the turning away from earthly pleasures as signs of virtue. The payoff, however, is not an objectively better life, but a life shaped by the needs and ressentiments of those who wield power to impose those values on others. The result is what he calls a life-denying ethic, even when it is cloaked in piety, charity, and self-sacrifice. The Christian ethos in the genealogy becomes a masterclass instrument of social control, a way of channeling power in ways that neutralize the vitality of the strong by making their strength seem suspect and their desires morally suspect as well. The task, then, is not to burn the old world to ash, but to revalue values, to reinterpret what counts as good and bad in such a way that life is enhanced rather than diminished, that strength, creativity, and risk-taking are not demonized, but integrated into a more robust and vibrant ethic. This is where the concept of amor fati enters with decisive clarity. Amor fati, literally love of fate, appears as a guiding imperative that asks us to embrace our lives as they unfold, rather than lamenting them or demanding that they bend to some external moral schema. The ethical horizon here shifts from a fear of life's contingencies to a fearless commitment to life as it is. To love one's fate is not passive resignation. It is a transformative stance that seeks to affirm every moment of one's experience, even in suffering, as part of a larger movement of becoming. Nietzsche's own formulation is explicit, amor fati, that is, that one should love nothing but one's fate. In English, we often hear the bite and beauty of the claim, to want what actually happens, to find meaning in the weave of one's lived history, to craft oneself as a work of art in the midst of circumstance. This theme is not merely existential, it has a clear political and cultural charge. If we stop at the surface, we may mistake Nietzsche's call for self-overcoming or the creation of new values as simply a license for individual self-assertion or as a prescription for ruthless domination. But Nietzsche carefully positions the project as a reorientation of the will to power towards self-mastening, self-overcoming as a form of courage and responsibility rather than an assertion of raw domination. In this sense, his call to revalue values is not a path to mere nihilistic anarchy or crude elitism. It is a test of the moral imagination. Can we imagine a set of values that would sustain life, nourish excellence, and enable human flourishing without recourse to the traditional sacral guarantees that have eroded? The aspiration to revalue is itself a form of moral growth, a demand that we examine the conditions under which we call something good, and ensure that those conditions do not enslave life's deepest capacities. To ground this discussion more concretely in Nietzsche's own textual line, consider the genealogical critique of good and evil in the genealogy of morals. The work opens with a provocative question about the origin of our terms for moral valuation. The early essays argue that good did not begin as a universal moral category, but as a designation of those who were powerful, those who exercised influence, wealth, and noble standing. The later inversion, where the weak revalue the terms, unfolds as a drama of ressentiment. The key banner line often cited is that the slave revolt in morals begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative. Here is the birth of moral categories that pretend to be universal, but are secretly anchored in the social drama of who dominates and who suffers. Nietzsche's analysis is not content to condemn Christianity as a mere doctrine. It exposes a long chain of moral production that ends with the good of the poor, the pious, the chastened, which is, in effect, the inversion of the good of the powerful, the noble, the brave. The moral vocabulary grows heavy with judgments that appear to celebrate humility, meekness, pity, and self-denial, but Nietzsche insists that these values are not universal goods but strategic responses to a historical condition of weakness. The evil of power becomes transformed into something virtuous as a response to powerlessness, and the new good, the virtues of the weak, becomes the moral currency by which the strong must now measure themselves. It is here that Nietzsche's critique takes on its most provocative form. If we adopt the Christian ascetic ideal as the benchmark of virtue, we are endorsing a life-denying program that suppresses the flourishing of natural energies, genius, and the creative impulse. The ascetic ideal's reach is startling in its breadth. Priests promote self-denial as a path to spiritual salvation. Philosophers sanitize self-control as a path to truth. Scientists sometimes present rigorous self-discipline as an instrument of objective knowledge. Artists, in their own way, awaken us to the beauty of restraint and pain, yet often under the pressure of social expectations to produce works that fit a market or a canon. Nietzsche's cumulative claim is that the ascetic posture, whether cloaked in religious prayer, in secular rationalism, or in aesthetic or scientific temperaments, has become a default ethos that denies life's most fundamental energies. The danger is that this ethos, this habit of viewing life as something to endure, to master through denial, paralyzes the very capacity to shape values that would sustain richer forms of human flourishing. If the master-slave story is the genealogical hinge, the ascetic ideal is the ethical hinge. The two interact in ways that show how the gradients of power, resentment, and fear shape what counts as virtuous and what counts as condemnable. The result is a complex mosaic, a culture in which nobility and virtue are not stable, universal anchors, but shifting positions within a political and psychic economy. Nietzsche's worry is that the current structure renders life unsatisfying and finally unsustainable, because it disdains the very energies that give life its taste and complexity. The revaluation of values then becomes an invitation to a more robust flourishing, a life-affirming ethic that values strength, courage, creativity, and the capacity to bear the burdens of freedom without surrendering to cynicism or despair. The conceptual framework of revaluation leads us toward a central imperative that Nietzsche explicitly articulates: the call to become more than we are, not through sheer conquest of others, but through the conquest of our own limiting beliefs and our own automatisms of moral thought. The will to power is not a crude doctrine of domination. It is, for Nietzsche, the fundamental dynamic of life, the force by which beings strive to exert themselves, to grow, to create meaning through their own choices. The will to power is not an external program handed down from a transcendent law. It is a faithful reflection of vitality, risk, and the courage to say yes to life even in the face of suffering. And the revaluation of values becomes the instrument by which the individual can harness this will to power toward ends that enhance life rather than diminish it. In this sense, Nietzsche does not propose a set of fixed rules like an ethical code that prescribes every action. He proposes a horizon, an orientation toward life that invites us to test every value, to ask with courage where it comes from, who benefits, who is harmed, and whether it hinders or enhances the fullness of human existence. This is where the idea of the positive program emerges, though it is a program that remains unsettled, experimental, and open-ended. The overman, or the Ubermench, if taken in this spirit, is not a tyrant figure who imposes new rules from above. He or she is someone who creates new values from within the power of his or her own life, who resists the pressure to live by inherited formulas that kill life's spontaneity. The call to revaluation, then, is a call to be editors of one's own life. It is to fashion one's own moral instrument, test it against reality, and revise it in response to experience. This is where Nietzsche's work intersects with a broader historical conversation about meaning and responsibility. We can cross-reference Kierkegaard and Kant here. Kierkegaard, for his part, critiqued the Christian faith from the inside, showing how faith can demand a leap that isolates the individual from the ethical universals that bind society. Kant, with his moral law, offers a counterpoint, a universality grounded in rational duty, a law that commands respect for the other. Nietzsche's critique of the ascetic ideal and his insistence on life-affirming revaluations is not simply opposite to Kant. It challenges the very possibility of a universal moral law that is external to life's concrete conditions. Nietzsche invites a more situational, aesthetic, and existential approach to value, one that is not indifferent to universal questions of human dignity and freedom, but insists that any universal must itself be tested for its life-enhancing capacity. In the mid and late 20th century, the intellectual weather around Nietzsche's ideas grew more complicated. Sartre's existentialism, Camus's lucid explorations of revolt and absurdity, and Foucault's investigations into power and knowledge each grapple with nihilism, meaning, and the social architecture of values. Sartre's insistence that existence precedes essence and Camus's call for a moral life within the absurd share, with Nietzsche a concern for how we form meaning when the old gods have fallen away. Yet Nietzsche's project remains distinctive. He invites a radical reevaluation not only of what we count as morally acceptable, but of the very reasons we pursue such values in the first place. Foucault's archaeology and genealogy of discourses resonates with Nietzsche's method, and the two thinkers, in dialogue across a century, illuminate how power shapes knowledge and how knowledge can shape power in turn. The cross-references reveal a web of concern. How do we ground norms in human life if we refuse to pretend that life's vitality is reducible to a single sacred code? The modern reception of Nietzsche, however, has not been a clean, unified conversation. It has been messy, contested, and sometimes dangerous. the editing and publication history around Nietzsche's manuscripts adds a cautionary note. Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche's posthumous editing and the public's reception of Nietzsche as author of grand, militant ideologies created a distortion that many scholars still untangle. The 1880s, with the early proclamations of God is dead, culminate in 1888 with Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist as polemical works that sharpen the edge of the critique, and for some readers, lend themselves to misuses. The epilogue of this reception involves not only philosophical reading but historical misuses, where the rhetoric of revaluation and mastery can be pressed into the service of power for oppressive ends. Nietzsche's own tone remains cautionary and self-distancing, insisting that the danger is always present. The risk that the will to power becomes the only law, that the pursuit of life's fullness becomes a justification for domination or for cynicism about the value of others' lives. In this sense, the counterarguments become essential to a mature reading of Nietzsche. One central concern is normative guidance. If Nietzsche's critique reveals how values arise, how do we proceed to prescribe better ones? The risk that a purely critical project undermines any moral ballast, leaving us with a form of relativism or instability, has haunted readers. If all values are products of power and ressentiment, what prevents the strong from simply violating vulnerable populations under the banner of free creation? Nietzsche's own response to this worry is not to collapse into relativism, but to insist that life-affirming values must themselves be tested against the vitality they promise. The question becomes, what kind of life is worth affirming, and what conditions must hold to sustain it? A second counterargument is elitism or nihilism. If the revaluation appears to celebrate the strong, some worry that it empowers a new aristocracy of power that could justify cruelty or arrogance. Nietzsche anticipates these lines and pushes back by arguing that true life affirmation requires a certain responsibility toward the flourishing of others, the cultivation of excellence that refuses to abandon those who suffer, and a recognition that power without wisdom and wit becomes cruel. The danger of nihilism arises when the new values fail to resist life-denying tendencies, or when the very concept of value is collapsed into sheer power. Nietzsche's own language insists on a cautious optimism, not a licentious indulgence. The call to revalue is a form of moral pedagogy, a training of the will to assess value with an eye to life's resilience. Another important set of critiques concerns whether Nietzsche provides a positive program or merely a critical stance. Is the revaluation of values a practical guide for political living, or is it an aesthetic wager, an invitation to cultivate a different sensibility that might not translate into concrete social policies? The tension deepens when we consider the possibility that Nietzsche's philosophy might dissolve into a kind of nihilism if taken as an anti-normative, anti-universal retreat. Yet Nietzsche himself remains committed to a constructive horizon, the creation of new values that can sustain a higher form of life, even if that form is not entirely defined in advance. The risk that his framework could be misused to justify oppressive power is real, and the historical record confirms this danger, but it also serves as a warning about how ideas are redeployed in different contexts. Reading Nietzsche responsibly means keeping the complexity of his project in view. He is diagnosing a crisis and urging us to invent a response that is both courageous and compassionate, that honors the demands of life and recognizes the dangers of turning power into the sole measure of value. Amid these debates and dangers, we encounter a series of real-world applications and modern interpretations that illustrate the staying power and precariousness of Nietzsche's argument. The call to revalue values has fueled debates in education, ethics, and cultural criticism. If the old religious or secular normative systems lose their grip, what vision of education could prepare individuals to revalue and to recreate their lives in ways that are both personally meaningful and socially responsible? How can institutions foster an ethos of life affirmation without endorsing elitist arrogance or dehumanizing power? These questions push us toward an art of judgment and a craft of living that Nietzsche dramatizes in his prose as a form of existential artistry. We can see echoes of this in the way contemporary moral philosophy grapples with the human costs of various ethical theories, the role of virtue in a pluralistic society, and the need to balance freedom with responsibility in political life. The modern interpretive map thus expands. Nietzsche is not a dogmatic architect who hands us a blueprint. He is a provocateur who asks us to become the kind of person capable of designing a life and a culture that can hold both risk and beauty, responsibility and audacity, without surrendering to despair or toward a cruel, cold serenity. To illustrate this in the most tangible terms, let us anchor two vivid examples from Nietzsche's own work. First, the genealogical critique of good and evil in the genealogy of morals. The first essay insists that our moral valuations have historical roots, not universal claims about the nature of the good. It follows the genealogy across periods and groups, tracing how good comes to be identified with nobility and how bad arises as a label for those who are non-noble or marginalized. The second essay introduces ressentiment as the engine of moral inversion. It is not the strong who create the new morality, but the weak who, in failing to secure their own power, invert the values of the powerful to frame their own weakness as virtue. The culmination of this analysis is a clarion example of how moral language can obscure the relations of power and how the weak's good functions to protect their own sense of righteousness, even as it undermines vitality and flourishing. This is a powerful tool for any reader who wants to examine the moral vocabulary of the present, the social judgments that operate at the level of everyday life, and the way religious or secular ethics can serve as a cloak for social control. Second, the critique of Christian ethics as life-denying. Nietzsche's argument is not simply that Christian ethics demands a certain set of behaviors. He claims that Christianity displaces life's inherent value by turning attention towards suffering, guilt, and otherworldly rewards. The ascetic ideal, whether expressed through the clerical, philosophical, scientific, or artistic life, becomes a discipline that disciplines life itself, often at the cost of vitality. The promise of redemption becomes the mechanism by which life's passions, instincts, and particularities are governed or suppressed. The rise of life-denying impulses contrasts with the birth of life-affirming impulses, by which Nietzsche means an ethos that does not see suffering as good by necessity or as the gate to meaning, but as an experience to be overcome, shaped, and integrated into a form of existence that celebrates strength, creativity, and responsible freedom. The call to revalue, then, is a call to reimagine suffering as something that can be transfigured into meaning without surrendering to despair. A third example, more implicit but equally vital, concerns the rise of life-affirming impulses in the call to revalue values. The will to power, rightly interpreted, is not a program of domination, but a way of affirming life's singularities, the capacities to propose, to risk, to suffer, and to endure. The revaluation is a call to cultivate joy in the struggle of becoming rather than to submit to a pre-existing decree of what counts as virtuous. The new values would be these kinds of commitments: the courage to face the fact of mortality, the willingness to recognize limits and to surpass them, the readiness to create meaning through art, science, love, and friendship, the insistence that power must be tempered by responsibility, compassion, and the recognition of the dignity of others. In this sense, the life-affirming impulses are not a rejection of morality, but a transformation of it, an invitation to devise norms that can sustain life's exuberance and depth, even as we confront tragedy, contingency, and the unknown. The historical anecdotes that frame Nietzsche's thought are not ornamental. They are living markers of how his ideas traveled, sometimes in surprising directions, sometimes misread or weaponized. The 1882 appearance of God is dead in the gay science is not an empty slogan, but a cultural diagnosis. It marks a moment when European secular culture had to confront the consequences of a moral order that no longer rests on a transcendent guarantor. The public response to this proclamation, including the temptations to a new dogmatism or to reckless skepticism, reveals both the seductive power and the peril of Nietzsche's program. The 1888 Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist function as culminating polemics, sharpening the critique and pushing toward a more radical revaluation. They show a philosopher who has moved from diagnosis to exhortation. They show a thinker who believes that moral life demands not simply critique, but a kind of courage to imagine new forms of life that can resist the pull of nihilism. A final historical note concerns Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche's editing after Nietzsche's death. Her influence reshaped how the public encountered Nietzsche, often to emphasize the political and conservative readings of his work in ways that Nietzsche never fully endorsed. The careful reader must distinguish between the raw statements of the man writing and the cultural history of how those statements were interpreted, sometimes misinterpreted, or weaponized by others. This caution becomes not a mere footnote but a moral discipline when we consider how philosophical ideas travel and are used. We must read Nietzsche with attention to context, to the integrity of the original voice, and to the way the text invites a living conversation rather than a definitive code. In sum, Nietzsche's project in this segment of his philosophy is to reveal the fragility of our most cherished values, and to offer a method by which we might preserve their integrity while freeing life from reverence for what denies life's vitality. The death of God is a cultural event, not a cause for celebration. because it withdraws the ultimate sanction from life's impulses and invites us to craft new sanctions that are answerable to the conditions of our own existence. The risk of nihilism is real, particularly if we mistake critique for replacement by a different dogma or a new barbarism. The antidote, ambitious, demanding, but potentially transformative, is the revaluation of all values, the willingness to test our beliefs by the way they affect life, and the courageous embrace of amor fati. To love one's fate is to commit to living with intention, to creating values that sustain life's complexity and depth, and to resist the drift towards cynicism or tyranny. In the contemporary moment, this is not a call for resignation to power or for a triumph of the will in a brutal sense. It is a warning and a proposal. Be wary of any system that denies the body, the passions, the particularities that make a human life unique. Be wary of moral vocabularies that claim universality while masking social arrangements that privilege some at the expense of others. Be willing to test your beliefs against the most severe readings of pain, failure, and loss, and be willing to reconfigure your commitments if they prove to be life-denying. And above all, cultivate the art of loving fate, the practice of turning even misfortune into a site of meaning, the discipline of turning pain into a form of beauty through which one can contribute to a life larger than one's own solitary needs. The reader or listener might ask, what do we do with this in practice? The answer is not a single recipe. It is a stance, a set of dispositions, and a continuous conversation with the world. It begins in the small arenas of daily life, our choices, our ambitions, our commitments to others, our patience with uncertainty. It continues in the larger spheres of culture, education, politics, and public life, where we must ask whether our institutions encourage life's vitality or insulate themselves behind rituals of fear, guilt, or obedience. It asks for a maturity of judgment, the capacity to resist the seductive comfort of inherited traditions when they obstruct life's fullness, the discipline to craft new norms that support creativity, responsibility, and solidarity. It invites a novelist's eye to the human condition, a philosopher's patience to test beliefs, and a poet's tenderness to recognize that life's worth often rests not on mastery alone, but on the beauty and fragility of beings trying to become themselves. As we close this segment, we return to the center of Nietzsche's invitation, the command to revalue. It is a summons that echoes beyond the particular pages of the gay science and the genealogy of morals into the present day. It invites us to ask, what counts as good in your life? What has your culture taught you to fear, to admire, to condemn? How can you shape a personal ethic that sustains your vitality and respects the equal worth of others? The maxim amor fati can serve as a companion on this journey, a reminder that the path toward life's fullness does not require the erasure of moral obligations. Rather, it demands a rigorous examination of why we call something good, how it serves life, and what it would take to sustain it for both ourselves and those around us. It is a call to imagine, to risk, to create, and to love what we find, our fate, our circumstances, our world, and to transform them into a life that, even when confronted by mystery and pain, remains a source of meaning, strength, and above all, a reverent, unyielding, life-affirming courage. Today, we turn to a strand of Nietzsche's thought where aesthetics ceases to be a mere setting for philosophy and becomes a primary engine for diagnosing culture. In Friedrich Nietzsche's world, art is not a luxury of the refined or a garnish on philosophy. It is a mode of life, a way of breathing through existence when the air of daily habit grows thick with comforts, conventions, and the pallid light of habit-forming routines. The central problem, then, is not simply what art is, but what art does to people, what it allows them to endure, and how it shapes what they are willing to value as worth living for. In this sense, Nietzsche's project in Birth of Tragedy and in the years that follow can be read as an audacious cultural diagnosis. He asks us to see civilization as a palimpsest written by the arts, by the kinds of life-affirming energies that are summoned when art conquers despair and fashions meaning out of chaos. The origins of Nietzsche's aesthetics in this sense lie at the crossroad where German Romanticism, classical philosophy, and a rising modern distrust of culture converge. To enter Nietzsche's aesthetics is to step into a conversation that is already ancient and startlingly modern at once. On one hand, the philosopher stands in a long tradition of reflecting on how art shapes human life. On the other hand, he is prepared to jolt that tradition awake with a question. Can art enact a leap beyond the merely mirroring of nature, beyond the cold law of necessity as described by the natural sciences, toward something that could alter the vitality of the human animal itself? The answer he proposes begins with a dramatic pair of forces, an Apollonian and a Dionysian. The Apollonian is the principle of form, proportion, and dreamlike clarity. It gives us boundaries, sculpture, the measured dancing of figures, the bright edge of a vase that makes sense of color by shaping it into a meaningful image. The Dionysian, in contrast, is a principle of intoxication, fusion, and the violent, almost primordial energy of life's vitality. It dissolves boundaries and makes us experience life as a single, terrible chorus of becoming. Nietzsche asks us to consider what happens when these two drives meet in the theater, where the audience is drawn into a communal breath, where individual isolation tears open to reveal a shared, dangerous ecstasy. The larger claim embedded in Birth of Tragedy is that tragedy is not the result of mere mimetic skill or clever plotting. It is the capacity to fuse form and fever, to transmute the raw power of life into a work that is at once beautiful and terrible, consoling and disturbing. To understand the crucible of this thought, we must look at Nietzsche's influences. He does not arrive at aesthetics from a vacuum. He inherits a dual tradition, the tragic sensibility that is at once a humane admiration of order and an almost metaphysical fascination with the depths. In a sense, he stands on the shoulders of the Greek poets and dramatists he reads, while simultaneously winking at certain German idealist presumptions about art as a mere refinement of nature. The existential weight of Schopenhauer's will and the phenomenology of life float through the pages as background hum, even as Nietzsche declares that the true artist is a creator who resists nihilistic absorption into the void by fashioning new ways of valuing the world. The result is an audacious rethinking of why art exists. It is not merely to comfort or to delight, it is to re-energize the living body, to reignite courage, and to furnish culture with a sustenance capable of resisting the creeping numbness of modern life. Let us be explicit about what Nietzsche argues in Birth of Tragedy. The central thesis is that Greek tragedy arises from a moment of theoretical synthesis, a balancing act that preserves a living vitality at the very edge of ruin. The theater becomes the stage upon which the Apollonian illusion and the Dionysian intoxication are reconciled long enough to yield a form that both reveals and transcends pain. This is not a calm, sterile intellect at work. It is a living, dangerous art that teaches the audience to endure and to affirm human being in its most precarious condition. In this sense, art is not merely a vehicle for truth, it is a way of living truth. Nietzsche is radical here in insisting that art must alter the vitality of those who participate in it, not merely entertain them. The aesthetic experience becomes a form of life creation, a disciplined reshaping of the subject's relationship to desire, fear, beauty, and mortality. To push this point with a concrete image, think of the tragic chorus as something like a community couching itself in a shared mood that is both perilous and elevating. The dancers and singers do not escape suffering. They transpose it into a coherent, form-laden expression. The Apollonian line, the gray-blue horizon of order, gives the scene its structure. The Dionysian surge, the primal, merciless river of life, gives it its depth and intensity. When they work together, tragedy becomes a kind of cultural technology, a practice by which a people can confront the most disorienting truths and yet emerge not crushed, but chastened, clarified, and newly directed toward a form of life that can bear itself. This is Nietzsche's bold wager, that art can become a power that changes human vitality, not simply a passive mirror of life. The argument in Birth of Tragedy has its own lineage in debates about aesthetics and culture that extend back to Aristotle, Plato, and Kant. Aristotle's Poetics, with its emphasis on mimesis, plot, and catharsis, frames tragedy as a disciplined imitation that has a purgative, ethical function for citizens. Plato in the Republic suspects art as a copy of appearances, a potential corrupter of the soul's rational order. Kant, stepping into a somewhat different arena, would insist that aesthetic experience rests on a disinterested pleasure that frees us from practical concerns enough to glimpse a sense of universal validity. Nietzsche does not simply repeat these positions, he reshapes them. He pushes Aristotle's discipline and Plato's suspicion into a new synthesis where art's form is inseparable from its vitality. He also challenges Kant's claim about disinterested judgment by arguing that the highest forms of aesthetic experience are intimately bound to the will to life, not a rational spectator's cool distance. In this sense, Nietzsche presses back against the polite, a priori claims of aesthetics and asks, what if the most powerful aesthetic experiences are precisely those that re-energize and reorient a life? To see how this plays out in actual claims and arguments, consider a famous line through what Nietzsche calls the vitality of art. Life is something that must be celebrated, even when it is unfolded through pain. In his later works, he sometimes formulates the perspective with the blunt honesty of a diagnostician rather than the tender indignation of a poet. He wants art to be more than decoration for comfortable minds. He wants art to be a force that rewires the nervous system of a culture. This is where the articulation of the modern appetite for comfort enters as a critical hinge. Nietzsche is not anti-comfort in the abstract. He is suspicious of comfort when it becomes a narcotic that makes a people passive, conformist, and docile before the reality of their own lives. The modern age, he argues, tends to cultivate a taste for ease and stability at the expense of vigor, risk, and self-overcoming. The aesthetic regime that results from such a drift, what he often calls a culture of soft, mass tastes, threatens the capacity for tragedy, the sense that life is meaningful because it is dangerous, precarious, and charged with significance even as it is unavoidably finite. In this sense, the aesthetic framework Nietzsche develops is a political diagnosis as well as a philosophical one. If art is capable of life affirmation, it becomes the antidote to nihilism, or at least a technique for resisting nihilism's seductions. The modern culture that prizes convenience, sameness, and the comfort of opinion becomes, in Nietzsche's vocabulary, a culture of the herd. The danger is that such a culture reduces life to a set of easily consumable experiences, a succession of experiences designed to reassure rather than awaken. The role of the artist then becomes crucial, not because the artist stands above politics, but because the artist can ethically harness power over form, mood, emotion, and social expectation, in order to reawaken the will to life. Religion, politics, and philosophy all become sites where art's power can either become a force of rejuvenation or a mechanism for domination and fatigue. This is the deeper political wager of Nietzsche's aesthetics. It is not that art should be political in a narrow sense, but that art has the power to reframe what culture esteems as valuable, to alter the vitality of citizens, and to press a civilization toward a new scale of human possibility. In this complex landscape, the figure of Richard Wagner occupies a critical, contested position. He stands as the best-known case study in Nietzsche's analysis of how art and politics mingle in myth, and how ideas about culture can be enlisted, rightly or wrongly, to shape public life. In The Birth of Tragedy, Wagner's music and dramaturgy are often treated as emblematic of the Dionysian energy that drives art toward a unifying, life-affirming intensity. Nietzsche's early admiration for Wagner is not merely a cultural preference. It is a hopeful wager that modern music drama could become the engine by which Germany, and by extension, modern Europe, could recover a sense of depth, fate, and meaning that modern rationality seemed to threaten to erase. Yet Nietzsche's relationship with Wagner is one of the defining tensions of his early philosophy. It is not simply a story of two personalities colliding. It is a story about how art, myth, and politics can be interwoven in a way that either liberates or enslaves a culture. The Wagnerian project, myth pursued through music, philosophy, and performance, appeals to Nietzsche's sense that human life must be organized around more than utility or sentiment. Art should be a force that forges unity from plurality, a force that makes possible a shared sense of belonging in the face of the terrifying contingency of existence. But Nietzsche also sees the political opportunism that accompanies Wagner's myth-making, the way myth can be harnessed to mass emotion and to a political program that eventually collides with Nietzsche's own concerns about power, freedom, and the integrity of the individual. The famous turn in Nietzsche's critique of Wagner, what some scholars call the Wagner affair, occurs in the late 1870s and culminates in writings such as The Case of Wagner, Der Fall Wagner, in 1888. In this period, the Wagner project still embodies a profound understanding of art's capacity to transvalue values, to convert suffering and chaos into form and meaning. But Nietzsche begins to see that myth itself can be weaponized, turned into a political instrument that seduces the public into an enchanted, almost religious reverence for a narrative that subsumes individuality into the mass. The music can become a spectacle that promises unity but risks consolidating power and stifling critical freedom. The myth can become a tool for legitimating political projects that Nietzsche finds dangerous, even when the aesthetic energy remains undeniably powerful and intoxicating. In this sense, Wagner becomes a contested test case, an artist of extraordinary power whose work does not straightforwardly align with Nietzsche's broader concerns about culture, power, and the fragility of modern life. Wagner's music and philosophy thereby illuminate what Nietzsche fears, that art, in its most compelling forms, can become both a medicine and a narcotic, a means of awakening conscience and a mechanism of control. This contested test case pushes Nietzsche toward a broader, more iconoclastic stance in his later writings. The later works, what many readers call the period of broad daylight Nietzsche, the late 1880s, show an increasingly relentless skepticism about traditional values, a sharpening edge toward the idea that culture must be reimagined not as a guardian of order, but as a provocation to transvaluation. The paradox is stark. The same energy that fuels the Dionysian intensities in Birth of Tragedy becomes, in Beyond Good and Evil and in his untimely essays, a more radical attack on moral assumptions, on conventional pieties, and on the comfortable beliefs that sustain modern life. The art that once seemed to rescue vitality now appears as a potential tool of anti-moss and anti-illusion, a blade that could cut through the comforting lies the comfortable self loves to tell itself. Nietzsche's aesthetic theory evolves towards something more iconoclastic, not merely an affirmation of life through beauty, but a sustained challenge to the moral and political premises of civilization, an insistence that culture must be nourished by provocations that disrupt comfort and awaken a more arduous form of life. To illustrate these developments in a concrete, ethically charged frame, we can turn to three interwoven threads. First, the sustained analysis of the Dionysian Apollonian tension as a lens for understanding both ancient Greek tragedy and modern cultural life. Second, Wagner's contested case as a lived laboratory for artistic power, myth-making, and political resonance. And third, the way Nietzsche treats art as a form of life affirmation, not only in the birth of tragedy, but also in Beyond Good and Evil and the later aphoristic writings. Each of these threads reveals a locus where aesthetic theory and cultural diagnosis meet, and where the question of how art can or should shape life remains open, unsettled, and deeply consequential. Let us begin with the test case of Greek tragedy and its enduring relevance for modern culture. In Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's Dionysian Apollonian analysis is not a retroactive claim about the past. It's an interpretive key for reading the present and diagnosing the future. The Greek stage, for Nietzsche, offers a model of a community that can bear the truth of life by learning to bear its contradictions within a disciplined, ceremonial form. The wine of Dionysus tears at boundaries, but the ritual structure of Apollonian form, music, chorus, meter, proportion, organizes that dissolution into something legible, something ethically legible to a community that must face its own mortality. When this synthesis works in Greek tragedy, it does so not merely by providing a cathartic release, but by creating a form in which vitality and meaning are actively cultivated. The modern world, however, especially one caught in the web of rationalization, bureaucratization, mass media, and consumerist appetite for comfort, tends to lift Apollonian control without ensuring a corresponding dynamism of the Dionysian force. In such a regime, art can become a polished surface, a decor for life's emptier rituals, rather than a pressure that awakens and reorders the life-woven energies of a people. The modern appetite for comfort in Nietzsche's sense is not merely a preference for soft furniture or easy pleasures. It is a structural disposition that seeks to minimize risk, ambiguity, and existential friction. The danger is not that people will dislike art. The danger is that art is absorbed into a cultural economy that reproduces passivity, standardizes sensibilities, and reduces the critical, unsettling power of art to a harmless, marketable experience. If art is to be more than decoration, it must be capable of imposing a discipline of perception, of arming the soul to withstand ambivalence, and of insisting that the human being remains a site of conflict between desire and judgment. Nietzsche's diagnosis here is not merely moralistic. It is metaphysical in the sense that it treats art as a central prop for placing life within a meaningful, perilous frame, rather than letting life drift toward an empty serenity that would erase difference, risk, and the possibility of new values. A second major thread concerns Wagner as a living, dangerous specimen of how art can become political myth and cultural power. Wagner's music drama is not neutral in Nietzsche's eyes. It embodies the pull between an intoxicating sense of wholeness and a dangerous temptation to unify people under a single, spectacular narrative. The power of such art is that it can mobilize mass sentiment. It can mobilize a people toward a shared destiny. It can, if misused, become the instrument of political and social manipulation. The Wagner case is thus a crucial litmus test for Nietzsche's conviction that the value of art lies not only in its beauty, but in what form of life it enforces, what values it elevates, and what ethical obligations it imposes on the beholder. Nietzsche's concern is not to discard Wagner or to condemn absolute charisma in the arts. It is to insist that any form of art that wields power over the collective psyche should be subject to rigorous critique and not allowed to substitute for genuine autonomy, critical thought, or moral discernment. The result is a nuanced account. Wagner's art demonstrates art's extraordinary force to shape human life and political possibility, yet it also exposes the perils when that force is harnessed to mythic narratives that close down pluralism, critical distance, and the discipline of interpretation. This tension lands Nietzsche in a position that grows more skeptical in his later writings. The critique becomes sharper, the provocations more explicit, and the appetite for iconoclasm more evident. In the case of Wagner and in the later, more combative aphorisms of the 1880s, Nietzsche argues that the artist's power must be kept under the discipline of philosophy and the conscience of culture. He refuses to grant artists the immunity to mold public life uncritically. Instead, he demands that the public be fortified to discern art's political uses, its capacity to shape belief, its potential to enthrall and seduce, and its possible seduction toward moral and political illusion. The later Nietzsche's stance is thus not simply an intensification of earlier aesthetic claims. It is a reorientation toward a more radical suspicion of the moral claims attached to aesthetic power, a suspicion that art should not serve as a pacifying balm or a legitimizing myth for social arrangements that undermine the very vitality art seeks to renew. This shift is also visible in how Nietzsche treats art as a form of life affirmation in both The Birth of Tragedy and Beyond Good and Evil. In the earlier treatise, art's life-affirming function is cast in the sublime register of a cosmic drama, where tension itself becomes meaning, where the human subject is not crushed by fate but is given the tools to say yes to life even as it is marked by suffering. This is the sense of life as a dangerous, luminous enterprise that art teaches us to inhabit. In Beyond Good and Evil, the energy of critique intensifies, and art is no longer simply the apotheosis of a tragic logic, but also a radical instrument of self-transformation. The aesthetic experience becomes a discipline in which the self is tested, the values by which a life is judged are exposed to revision, and the boundaries between aesthetics, ethics, and politics become porous to a new kind of life claim. Nietzsche's insistence that art can alter vitality remains, but its ethical terrain expands. The artist's task is no longer only to create moments of unity and intensity, but to keep alive a critical, self-surpassing energy within a culture that continually seeks to domesticate and anesthetize human longing. To anchor these claims in the concrete, let's consider three explicit examples that the text invites us to hold together. First, the Dionysian Apollonian tension is not abstract. It is a tool for understanding both Greek tragedy and modern culture. In the Greeks, the chorus and the stagecraft work to integrate the rough flux of life into a form that educates, strengthens, and binds a community. In modern culture, the same tension can be mobilized to educate, strengthen, and bind a community toward a more awakened form of life, rather than a passive appetite for ease. The test is whether modern art can harness form and fever in a way that creates a durable, public, and shared sense of meaning, rather than a temporary, intoxicating thrill that leaves citizens more pliant to cynical politics. Second, Wagner's music and philosophy serve as a contested test case for artistic power. Wagner's project to fuse philosophical depth with musical transcendence makes him a living laboratory for Nietzsche's claim that art can be a force that reorganizes collective energy. Yet the case also exposes the risk that myth and music, when deployed at scale in social and political life, can become instruments of manipulation or exclusion. The controversy reveals how art's power demands political and ethical discipline. It requires a critical audience, not mere rapture. It requires attention to the ways in which art can shape belief, desire, and identity in ways that are not transparently beneficial to human flourishing. Third, art as a form of life affirmation in The Birth of Tragedy and Beyond Good and Evil demonstrates the arc of Nietzsche's mature aesthetic thought. The early claim that art can reinvigorate vitality because it harmonizes the human being with the more than human mystery of life becomes, in later works, a critique of complacent morality and a challenge to the herd-like acceptance of convention. The idea that art can reframe what it means to live a human life persists, but its ethical and political implications become more complicated, more explicit, and more urgent. The art that serves life is not merely an ornament for the living. It is a force that can, if misused or misunderstood, become a weapon against the very autonomy it was meant to nurture. To appreciate Nietzsche's project's breadth and depth more fully, we must place it within a broader historical and intellectual frame. He is in dialogue with Aristotle's Poetics, the call to know how form generates meaning and how tragedy diffuses fear and pity through its structure. He is at odds with Plato's suspicion of art as dangerous illusion, and he is aligned with Kant only in the sense that he is concerned with how experience structuring judgment. Yet he diverges from Kant by insisting that aesthetic experience cannot be purely disinterested if it is to be truly life-affirming. It must connect to the will to life and the vitality of the organism. The later Nietzsche also converses with Bergson's duration, pitting continuous life flux against fixed forms, while insisting that art can mediate that flux in ways that awaken the powers of interpretation and valuation. Cross-referencing with later thinkers clarifies Nietzsche's singular stance. Gilles Deleuze will later cultivate a reading of Nietzsche that emphasizes difference, variance, and becoming, the idea that Nietzsche's philosophy is a laboratory for thinking through multiplicities rather than fixed essences. Deleuze reads Nietzsche's notion of the eternal recurrence and the will to power as a way to think difference and deterritorialization in philosophy and art. In Deleuze's hands, Nietzsche's aesthetics becomes a machinery for rethinking how art produces new modes of life and thought that resist oppressive normalizations. In a related vein, Mitchell Foucault's later analyses of culture and power show a way to understand Nietzsche's concerns about institutions, normativity, and the shaping of subjectivities. Foucault's focus on power, knowledge, and how discourses organize life resonates with Nietzsche's fear that mass culture can produce gentle, uncritical subjects who mistake comfort for health and safety for truth. The reception of Nietzsche in these later contexts reveals a track of influence. Nietzsche's aesthetics becomes not simply a theory about tragedy in ancient Greece, but a provocative vocabulary for analyzing how power, whether political, cultural, or epistemic, shapes what counts as art, what counts as life, and what counts as worth living. We should, of course, acknowledge counterarguments to Nietzsche's aesthetics, and in doing so we illuminate why his project remains so provocative. First, critics argue that Nietzsche's aesthetic claims rest on myth and metaphor rather than demonstrable argument. The Apollonian-Dionysian dichotomy sometimes reads like a poetic intuition rather than a logically tight system. The risk is that the terms themselves lack stable definition, leaving the theory vulnerable to charges that it is a grand narrative built on a series of vivid metaphors rather than a rigorous explanatory framework. Nietzsche himself would reply that the lived experience of art, how people respond to it, how cultures are formed by it, how values are reconfigured in its light, counts as a form of evidence if we understand philosophy as a discipline that seeks to interpret life, not merely to prove propositions. But the critique remains. The emphasis on mythic force can obscure the need for empirical, historical, or social analysis of how art actually functions within different cultural contexts. Second, concerns about elitism or elitist politics intrude when Nietzsche's language becomes a tool for excluding others from culture or from the right to interpret or contribute to the creation of values. The danger is that a theory of life-affirming art might slide, inadvertently or deliberately, into a justification for hierarchies or for an aesthetic of superiority. If art is the medium of vitality, who gets to decide who has vitality, who is permitted to challenge and revalue? Nietzsche's response would likely insist that he does not propose a fixed aristocracy of taste, but a kind of philosophical courage to resist the seductions of mass culture, even as he recognizes that those seductions are potent. The problem then becomes not one of the right to participate in culture, but of the responsibility of those who would challenge or renew culture to develop practices that invite collective engagement rather than mere domination of one class by another. A third counterargument concerns the political uses of Nietzschean rhetoric in modern contexts. Critics warn that art's power, if divorced from a robust political ethics, could become a tool for propaganda or for justifying authoritarian or anti-democratic projects in the name of vitality or life affirmation. Nietzsche himself did not cultivate a stable political program. Instead, he wove a critique of moral and cultural conventionality that is difficult to translate into a policy or a program. The risk, then, is that readers might extract a simplified, even explosive, doctrine about power, risk, and culture, and apply it to contemporary politics in ways Nietzsche could not have anticipated. His own later letters and writings show an anti-polemical sensibility that refuses to reduce art to a political instrument, but the temptation to do so survives in modern readings. Thus one must read Nietzsche with care about the historical specificity of his politics, his ambivalence toward authority, and his insistence that life's vitality must not be coerced or commodified into slogans. In responding to these counterarguments, the best path is to read Nietzsche not as a manual for society, but as a provocateur of imagination, someone who asks not just what art is, but what it could do in the service of life that is more courageous, more self-critical, more capable of sustaining a sensibility that makes life worth living even in the face of fragility and mortality. The philosophical payoff of this stance is to broaden our understanding of culture, not simply as a set of institutions, but as a living field in which persons, communities, and publics learn to perceive, to value, and to respond with renewed aliveness. In this sense, Nietzsche's aesthetics remains an enduring prompt to ask, what kind of culture would we design if we allowed art to reconfigure our sense of what is possible for human life? To close, let us sketch a few cross-references that can help a reader or a listener trace Nietzsche's aesthetic thought through its genealogy and its afterlife. Aristotle's Poetics remains a necessary point of reference for understanding how form and narrative function to shape emotion and judgment in tragedy. Plato's critique of art as deceptive remains a crucial tension in thinking about art's ethical responsibilities. Kant's aesthetics provides a standard by which we can measure the claim that art belongs to a disinterested domain, against which Nietzsche argues that aesthetic experience is inseparable from life-affirming energy. Bergson's Duration offers a language for thinking about life's tempo and the sense in which art can apprehend or elude fixed forms. Deleuze's Nietzsche and Philosophy of Difference urges us to read Nietzsche as a thinker of multiplicities, whose ethics of becoming are inseparable from his aesthetics. Foucault's later notions of culture and power present a framework for analyzing how institutions, discourses, and practices shape what counts as art, what counts as life, and what counts as the right to interpret those terms. Together, these cross-references illuminate how Nietzsche's aesthetics is neither a simple theory of beauty nor a retreat into mysticism, but a robust, demanding practice of reading culture as a living, contested field in which art can either fortify life with courage and invention or risk becoming a tool of complacency and domination. Quotes from primary sources help ground these reflections in Nietzsche's own voice. We can hear his insistence that art is not merely decorative but essential to life when he writes, "Without music, life would be a mistake." This line is a stark reminder that beauty is not a passive experience for Nietzsche. It is a force that can reconfigure one's willingness to endure, to suffer, to hope, and to fight for something beyond the immediate and the comfortable. Another direct phrase anchors the tradition of art as a defense against the truth's harsher demands. We have art in order not to die of the truth. In other words, art offers a durable medium, form, metaphor, symbol, through which human beings can confront truth without dissolving into despair. And a third line was Mich nicht umbringt, macht mich stärker, that which does not kill me makes me stronger, returns us to the existential edge of Nietzsche's thought. Art must participate in that edge, harnessing life's wounds to forge new strength, new values, and new ways of saying yes to life. In the end, the journey through Nietzsche's aesthetics, through the birth of tragedy, through the Wagner affair, through his later, iconoclastic provocations, is a journey into the question of what life demands from art. It is a question about how a culture can cultivate the nerve, the imagination, and the critical heart to resist the seductions of mere comfort, and to cultivate a vitality capable of bearing truth, beauty, risk, and loneliness without dissolving into cynicism or despair. If we listen closely, we hear Nietzsche urging us to imagine how art might reshape not only what we see or feel, but how we live, how we govern ourselves and our communities, what we deem valuable, what we will risk for, and what it would take to endure the truth with a stubborn, generous courage. This is the enduring claim of Nietzsche's aesthetic philosophy, that art is at its best a form of life, a stubborn, luminous craft through which human beings learn to endure, to change, and to become more fully themselves. It is a claim that continues to challenge, haunt, and inspire, inviting us to rethink the very nature of culture, the power of art, and the possibilities of living well in a world that is always both beautiful and perilous. As we turn toward the task of reading Nietzsche today, we are invited to slow our pace, to listen for the voices within his pages as if we stood in a crowded hall where philosophy, poetry, biography, and provocation mingle. Nietzsche does not offer a single map with labeled roads and a clear destination. He offers a weathered compass, a set of resonant questions, a stubborn refusal to hand us a comforting consensus. Reading him well is not a matter of swallowing a doctrine whole, but of learning to think with him, to study the texture of his sentences, to notice where he speaks in a whisper and where he roars, to track the shifts between genre and intention, and to attend to how his mood and moodiness illuminate or obscure his claims. The aim, in this sense, is not to adopt Nietzsche as a passport stamp that guarantees entry into a club, but to practice a kind of attentiveness that makes living thought possible. If we begin with origins, we discover a philosopher who arrived in the late 19th century, already engaged in a dramatic conversation with the tremors of modernity. He did not arise from nowhere, nor did he stand still. He stands on the shoulders of a long chain, the German philosophical tradition that begins with Kant and Hegel, but also the more anticipatory strains of Schopenhauer, who speaks of the will as the blind force behind all appearances. Nietzsche inherits that void in which the will to live, the will to power, and the will to interpret are never simply given as a settled metaphysical fact. He strips away the veils of naive certainty, pushes through the grand narratives of moral life, and asks whether our most cherished values are protective illusions or instruments of life's flourishing. He is at once a child of his age and a provocateur against it, a scholar of classical culture who wants to decreate the comfortable legibility of tradition so that new meanings might emerge. To understand Nietzsche, we must notice the way he stages his arguments across different genres. The Birth of Tragedy, his first major work, treats art and the fate of the ancient Greek spirit as a kind of laboratory where the Apollonian order and the Dionysian intoxication meet, a clash that reveals something about how human beings live, suffer, and seek relief through beauty. The early work shows a mind that has not yet settled into a single argumentative form, but is testing whether philosophy should speak with the precision of a science or the openness of a lyric. The gay science moves more deliberately into aphorisms, a collage of voices and observations that invites the reader to participate in a kind of interpretive mosaic. Then comes the more systematic ambition of Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals, attempts to articulate a critical philosophy that aims to destabilize received authorities and offer new routes for life. And yet even in his most programmatic books, Nietzsche remains alive to the power of style, the energy of metaphor, the danger of slogans, and the possibility that a sentence spoken in a moment of personal crisis may carry more resonance than a treatise produced in the calm of a university. A crucial matter in reading Nietzsche is to track the textual order with care. He often writes in a way that resonates across genres and across different moods, and his books are not the same kind of thing. The poems, the dialogues, the parables, the short provocations, the sustained philosophical argument, these elements sit beside one another, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. The danger for readers today is to treat the whole of Nietzsche as if it were a single logical system in which one aphorism neatly implies another. In truth, the order of reading matters. The aphorisms in the gay science may leap from one topic to another with startling speed, requiring us to hold the thread of his question while following several trains of thought at once. Thus Spoke Zarathustra presents a narrative in which the protagonist's journey and the book's emblematic scenes become a way of thinking through concerns about power, transcendence, and becoming. Beyond Good and Evil offers a more thoroughgoing critique of morality, but its argumentative structure is dense, full of subtle transitions, enjambments, and often paradoxical moves that demand careful, patient reading. Genealogy of Morals, with its genealogical method, teaches us to ask where our moral judgments take their source and what interests they reveal, once we follow the trails of history rather than accept moral categories as timeless givens. In this effort to read today, we should also understand the stakes of translating Nietzsche. The two translations that have most shaped English language reception in the modern period belong to contrasting worlds of interpretation. Walter Kaufmann's translation, which emerged in the mid-20th century, reframes ideas with a humane, accessible tone, inviting readers to see Nietzsche as a challenging critic of religion and morality rather than merely a provocateur. Then R.J. Hollingdale's translations, which became widely used by a generation of readers and scholars, tend to preserve a certain roughness and a directness that many find faithful to Nietzsche's abrasive clarity. Translation is not a neutral act. It is an interpretive choice that can tilt the balance between connotation and denotation, between wind and weather in a sentence, and between Nietzsche's lyrical cadences and his analytic rigors. Editorial histories compound that effect. The Will to Power, a posthumous compilation assembled by Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche and her circle, raises further questions about authorship, selection, and interpretation. When we walk into Nietzsche's corpus, we must walk with a historian's caution and a reader's sympathy, aware of how the text you read shapes what you think you are reading. Let us outline the major way Nietzsche has been read and misread in modern times, for this is not merely a matter of historical curiosity, but a practical guide for readers who wish to avoid easy shortcuts. One broad trajectory is the interpretation of Nietzsche as a founder of existentialism, a figure who helps individuals decide who they will become in the face of an indifferent universe. This reading resonates with Sartre's insistence that existence precedes essence and Camus's meditation on revolt in the face of absurdity. Yet Nietzsche's language is not metaphysical in the same way Sartre's is, and his insistence on the creative will, his eternal recurrence, and his critique of modern morality demand a different form of response than the one Sartre frames for an ethics of authenticity. To read Nietzsche well alongside existentialists, we must ask, what does authentic living mean in a world where meaning is not handed down from above, but made by our own becoming? How can one sustain a sense of responsibility, a horizon of value, without sliding into a nihilistic blank or a cynical instrumentality? A second broad trajectory concerns post-structuralist engagements with Nietzsche, where Foucault, Derrida, and others draw from his call to historicize values, to problematize the fixed order of truth, and to insist that power and knowledge are inseparable. Reading Nietzsche here means listening for the ways in which power is not only a political category, but a structure of interpretation that shapes what counts as meaningful, valuable, or true. It also means looking for the tension in Nietzsche's own stance. He relentlessly interrogates systems, but his own writing becomes a system of signs, an invitation to the reader to do the ongoing work of interpretation rather than to settle into a final doctrine. How then do we maintain fidelity to Nietzsche's energy and skepticism, without letting his rhetoric dissolve into mere relativism or slip into political co-optations that he would have repudiated. A third line of response, often neglected by readers who focus only on the sharp edge of critique, emphasizes Nietzsche's own psychology, his sense of life's fragility, and his insistence on the importance of affect, habit, and character. Cognitive science and moral psychology today explore questions Nietzsche wrestled with long before those fields existed. How do humans form moral intuitions? What is the role of emotion in ethical judgment? How do people recruit stories to explain why they live as they do? Nietzsche's method, perspectivism, his suspicion of singular vantage points, his insistence that truths are tentative and often bound up with life conditions, provides a powerful complement to contemporary work in these disciplines. To read Nietzsche with these currents in mind is not to use him as a straw man to prove a point about modern science, but to treat him as an interlocutor whose challenges to moral absolutism can sharpen our own thinking about truth, value, and human motivation. Let us turn to a concrete map of Nietzsche's major works and what each contributes to a cohesive understanding. The Birth of Tragedy begins with a speculative meditation on art, fate, and the crisis of ancient culture, introducing the tension between the Apollonian order of form and the Dionysian force of intoxication. It's not merely about aesthetics, but about how a culture copes with the terror of existence, how meaning is constructed in moments when the veil seems thin. Reading Birth alongside later writings helps us see Nietzsche's lifelong concern with how life-affecting forces can harmonize reason and vitality or explode into nihilistic ruin. The Gay Science marks a crucial transition in Nietzsche's career. It is a book of plays of mind, of notes and poems and provocations that aim to awaken the reader from comfortable dogmas. In this work we encounter the famous announcement of God's death, a moment that is not a celebration of atheism, but a diagnosis of a cultural situation in which the old sources of meaning have lost their force, and the burden falls on us to create new ways of living. The book's famous aphorisms, parables, and brief meditations train us to attend to nuance, to hear multiple voices in a single moment, and to resist comforting totalizations. The Gay Science thus functions as a primer for Nietzschean skepticism, a workshop for living with questions rather than receiving ready answers. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a narrative exploration of becoming, is perhaps Nietzsche's most famous vessel for his central themes. The critique of herd morality, the call to self-overcoming, the figure of the overman, Ubermench, and the challenge to reimagine values in the face of nihilism. The book's poetic form and allegorical structure invite readers to inhabit a journey rather than to master a doctrine. It is not a manual of ethics, but a guide to a more courageous way of living in a world that resists predictability. Zarathustra's speeches address a host of concerns: love, friendship, ambition, loneliness, danger, and joy, through scenes that blur the line between philosophy and myth. To read Zarathustra well is to learn to hear Nietzsche's questions in their most luminous, most dangerous, most aspirational voice. Beyond Good and Evil tests the project of a critical philosophy that would unseat moral commonplaces and open up a more rigorous way of thinking about value, justice, and truth. It is a book that organizes criticisms of religion, metaphysics, and the moral sentiments that support them, but it does so with a style that demands careful attention to where the argument is developing, where it breaks, and how its argumentative momentum depends on bold, sometimes paradoxical moves. It is a text that rewards slow, repeated readings, a willingness to inhabit Nietzsche's fictional landscapes and his provocations long enough to discern the argument's architecture, even if you disagree with its conclusions. The genealogy of morals deepens Nietzsche's project of historical critique by asking not merely what we believe, but why we believe it and what histories our beliefs have served. Its method of tracing the origins of moral valuations, resentment, master-slave morality, the ascent of the priestly class and its moral codes, offers a rigorous antidote to the assumption that moral judgments are timeless truths rather than historical products. Reading this work alongside Beyond Good and Evil allows us to see Nietzsche's most thoroughgoing attempt to connect psychology, history, and philosophy. It is a kind of laboratory manual for moral interpretation, cautioning us against mistaking the origins of a value for its universal justification. Ex Homo and the Antichrist, like personal letters and harsh declarations, reveal another side of Nietzsche's project. A self-scrutiny that is fearless, often barbed, and relentlessly honest about his life, his faults, and his ambitions for philosophy itself. They remind us that Nietzsche's method is inseparable from his sense of personal risk and the emotional energy that fuels his critique. These works, read in their proper context, help us avoid converting him into a caricature of polemical rhetoric or into a cold gatekeeper of intellectual fashion. A practical map of Nietzsche's major works thus looks not like a straight highway, but like a circuitous path through a landscape of questions. It begins with the birth of tragedy, moves toward the gay science, and thus spoke Zarathustra as a way of cultivating an ear for Nietzsche's voice and a readiness to inhabit his mood, then proceeds to the more systematic challenges of beyond good and evil and genealogy of morals, before concluding with some of the more autobiographical and polemical texts. Each step offers a different vantage on the same persistent concerns. How do we live with truth when truth is often a contested thing? How do we respect life while resisting the sedation of dogma? How do we read a text that often refuses to tell a single, unambiguous story about what is right or valuable? When we discuss misreadings, because misreadings are as revealing as close readings, we can name at least two that have shaped the contemporary reception of Nietzsche in unfortunate ways. One misreading reduces will to power to a political program. The line of critique says, if the will to power appears in Nietzsche's notebooks as a theme, then it must be a blueprint for political domination. The problem with this reading is not that it misses the complexity of Nietzsche's notes, but that it neglects the context in which the text was produced and compiled. The Will to Power is a posthumous compilation, and its editing history reflects editorial intentions as much as Nietzsche's own. To treat it as a straightforward political program is to confuse a note-taking exercise with a finalized policy. Misreading it this way closes off a more careful engagement with Nietzsche's analysis of power as a psychological and cultural force, and with his insistence that power is a broad, often invisible influence in how we think, how we interpret, how societies discipline themselves, and how individuals shape their own lives. A second misreading is to read God is Dead as an outright endorsement of political atheism or a program for anti-religious legislation. Nietzsche's statement functions as a diagnostic, a claim about a cultural condition in which old religious narratives no longer supply the same moral and existential centrality as before. It is a claim about the condition of modernity, not a careful blueprint for political action. Reading God is Dead as a policy agenda risks flattening Nietzsche's critique into a weapon against religion, rather than a prompt to reimagine life in more honest, courageous, and creatively meaningful ways. The same misreading appears when one treats Zarathustra's rhetoric about the overman as a social order's requirement, an imperialist or eugenic project, rather than as a call to individual self-overcoming that respects others as fellow travelers in the long, difficult ascent toward authenticity and vitality. The misreadings are not just errors, they are invitations to pause, to re-engage with the context, to check translations, to listen for where the rhetoric becomes myth and where the argument claims a share in the life of reason. A practical note, Nietzsche's method insists on attention to genre and voice. The aphorisms of the gay science are not the same thing as the systematic arguments of beyond good and evil, and the long, almost juridical style of the genealogy of morals is not interchangeable with Zarathustra's narrative poetry. The reader who attempts to pass one for the other will likely walk away with a misunderstanding of both. This is why reading Nietzsche is not primarily about extracting a set of conclusions, but about learning to think with a style that resists a single master narrative. It is about practicing the art of listening to different voices in a single work and across works, noticing where a sentence speaks as a poet, where it speaks as a historian, where it speaks as a critic of culture, and where it speaks as a philosopher of life. In the modern reception of Nietzsche, two historical anecdotes are especially instructive for readers who wish to approach him with intellect, care, and humility. The first concerns the mid-20th century, when a generation of scholars, most famously Walter Kaufmann, reintroduced Nietzsche to an Anglophone audience in ways that emphasized his seriousness, moral seriousness, and ethical seriousness. Kaufmann's translations and his interpretive introductions helped many readers recognize Nietzsche as a thinker who challenges not only religious faith, but the very premises of moral dogmatism. His portrait, though not without its own biases, made Nietzsche accessible to readers who might otherwise be frightened by the rhetoric of the overman or the density of the genealogical method. The second anecdote concerns the later reception in France and Germany, and the challenging, sometimes ferocious, debates about what Nietzsche meant in a world altered by post-structuralism, deconstruction, and critical theory. The French reception, with its admiration for Nietzsche's suspicion of grand schemes and its willingness to incorporate his challenges into new philosophies of difference and power, often reinterpreted Nietzsche as the father of postmodern thought. German readings, too, have become more plural, as scholars have sought to disentangle Nietzsche's own philosophy from the later appropriation of his language by nationalist or reactionary currents. In both strands we see a common lesson: Nietzsche resists final readings. The more we try to fix him in one position, the more he resists, insisting that philosophy remains a living labor. Cross-references deepen our present understanding by connecting Nietzsche with thinkers who share a commitment to critical examination of values. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus illuminate a line of reading that emphasizes individual responsibility and freedom in a world without guaranteed meaning. Nietzsche does not give you a map to happiness, but he does insist that one must create value with stamina, honesty, and imagination in the face of contingency. The existentialist conversation with Nietzsche judges him not for being comforting, but for insisting that a person must decide how to live in the absence of ready-made answers. Post-structuralists like Foucault and Derrida take Nietzsche's method of questioning history and language as a starting point for their own projects. They ask how knowledge and power shape what we take as truth, how institutions discipline what counts as legitimate knowledge, and how our own self-understanding is always already an artifact of discourse. Nietzsche's insistence that truth is a matter of interpretation intersects with their insistence that meaning is produced through contested frameworks of language and power. This is not a collision of rivals, but a chance to hold Nietzsche and his interlocutors in a shared practice of critical reading. Contemporary cognitive science and moral psychology, too, offer a fruitful set of interlocutors for Nietzsche. They investigate how people form moral judgments, how emotions influence judgments about right and wrong, and how cognitive biases shape our sense of reality. Nietzsche anticipated some of these concerns through his emphasis on affects, mood, and the will to power as forces shaping what we call truth. He invites us to ask whether our strongest moral convictions arise from a healthy affirmation of life, or whether they are defenses against the fear of contingency. In this sense, his method can be read as a discipline of self-scrutiny, a call to understand what motivates our beliefs, what we fear, and how we might live with more courage, more honesty, and more creativity. A living guiding principle for modern readers is to balance literary, historical, and philosophical insights. Reading Nietzsche well means cultivating three modes of attention at once. The literary eye notices the energy of the prose, the rhythm of a sentence, the images that call us to imagine new possibilities. The historical eye tracks sources, influences, and the evolution of a thought over time, while the philosophical eye tests arguments, clarifies terms, and holds the claim to determine whether a value or a policy is warranted by reason or by habit and power. The best readers weave these modes together, not as a collage of impressions, but as a disciplined practice in which a phrase can be appreciated for its beauty, its historical moment, and its argumentative force. And because Nietzsche invites us to reimagine what it means to live well, it is appropriate to take him not as a doctrine to be internalized, but as a conversation partner who teaches us to question our own certainties with more nuance, more generosity toward others, and more resolve to live in a manner worthy of the questions we raise. Let us propose a practical reading pathway, a map for beginners that gradually leads toward the more demanding texts, while still keeping the core questions in view. The introduction might begin with a book that gives a broad, accessible sense of Nietzsche's themes without sacrificing intellectual rigor. The Gay Science serves this function well. It is accessible, often luminous, and it introduces the idea that life's meaning is to be made rather than found, that knowledge is a form of life-affirming interpretation rather than a mirror of objective reality. Starting here helps a modern reader become comfortable with Nietzsche's mood and style while training the ear to hear his distinctive cadence. The way a sentence can carry multiple voices, the way a seemingly light remark can carry a heavy insistence on life's seriousness. From there, a natural next step is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Reading it after The Gay Science allows the reader to appreciate Nietzsche's shift from aphorism to narrative, from the direct provocation of aphoristic line to the complex, symbolic exploration of how one might become a different person. Zarathustra's journey provides a focal point for discussing the possibility and perils of self-overcoming, a concept that plays a central role in Nietzsche's vision of a life lived with purpose, risk, and a refusal to surrender to herd values. The narrative form invites readers to feel the stakes and to notice how Nietzsche's rhetoric can be a catalyst for personal reflection as well as a critique of social norms. It also helps the reader become attuned to the danger of taking Nietzsche's rhetoric at face value, an important precaution, given the way his words can be misinterpreted as political ordinances rather than existential questions. After Zarathustra, a reader can move to Beyond Good and Evil. This book offers a more explicit, systematic attempt to revise the moral and epistemic landscape, a diagnostic that asks what it would mean to rethink morality from the ground up. It is where the reader should begin to notice Nietzsche's method as a project of historical and psychological analysis rather than a simple collection of aphorisms. Reading Beyond Good and Evil in tandem with the genealogy of morals helps to hone the reader's sense of how Nietzsche thinks about the origins of our moral systems. The genealogy of morals presents an even more rigorous historical and genealogical approach to evaluating the values that govern our lives. It's a demanding text, but it provides essential insight into how Nietzsche conceives the reciprocity between power, knowledge, and moral valuation. This sequence, the gay science Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy, offers a layered pathway, from accessible mood and questions to a more technical historical philosophical method. A final step is to engage with the more critical, sometimes controversial late works, The Antichrist, Twilight of the Idols, and Ex Homo. These works push Nietzsche's critique to a sharper edge, while also offering some of the most searing self-critique and self-portraiture in all philosophy. They reward careful attention to rhetoric and tone as well as to content, because in these volumes Nietzsche intensifies the challenge of distinguishing what he believes from how he writes, and what his personal stance reveals about his own intellectual arc. In this sense, a complete reading path would be The Gay Science, then Zarathustra, then Beyond Good and Evil, The Genealogy of Morals, and finally Twilight of the Idols, Ex Homo, and The Antichrist for a deeper sense of Nietzsche's cultural critique and moral psychology. To illustrate the reading path with concrete examples, consider two reading sequence suggestions that align with this layered approach. The first sequence begins with The Gay Science, then moves to Zarathustra, then to Beyond Good and Evil, and finally to Genealogy of Morals. The logic here is to acquaint the reader with Nietzsche's mood and rhythm, then to expose them to the narrative and dramatic energy of Zarathustra, then to the more explicit critique of morality and truth in the later books, and finally to the genealogical method that underwrites much of the critique. The second sequence starts with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, continues to the Genealogy of Morals, then to Beyond Good and Evil, and ends with the Antichrist and Twilight of the Idols. In this version, the reader engages with a narrative and a set of problems that culminate in a more intense, morally charged critique of religion, culture, and power. Both sequences aim to cultivate sensitivity to Nietzsche's stylistic shifts, while ensuring a steady ascent toward the more demanding parts of his corpus. What about misreadings, case studies that illuminate how to read with care? One common misreading is to treat Will to Power as a policy manual, rather than a set of exploratory notes about power, life, and interpretation. To generalize from the notes to a program of political action is to miss Nietzsche's insistence that the will to power is a lens through which life is experienced and interpreted, not a set of prescriptions for governance. A second misreading is to interpret God is Dead as a political manifesto against religion, rather than a diagnostic of the cultural crisis brought on by the decline of traditional religious authority. Reading these passages in their historical and textual context is essential to avoid turning Nietzsche into a political program without acknowledging the philosophical questions that drive his critique. How should we live when the old sources of meaning lose their force? How can we reimagine value in a way that preserves life's vitality while avoiding moral nihilism? A third misreading worth naming concerns the overemphasis on the famous aphorisms in isolation from Nietzsche's longer, more connected arguments. The risk is to assemble a set of punchlines without appreciating how Nietzsche's arguments evolve across a work, how a claim is supported by a wider frame, and how the rhetorical energy of a piece depends on the interplay of style, history, and purpose. A fourth misreading is to treat Nietzsche's rhetoric as a license for cynicism or cruelty, especially in political contexts. This risk underscores the need to attend to Nietzsche's own warnings, his insistence that philosophy must take life seriously, that the problem of value is not a matter of clever cynicism, but a call to courage, self-awareness, and responsibility for one's own life, and to distinguish rhetorical force from normative endorsement. In the realm of historical anecdotes, we should recall two episodes that shaped how later readers encountered Nietzsche. The first concerns the mid-20th century, when Kaufmann's translations and interpretive work helped recover Nietzsche's relevance to modern concerns about religion, morality, and human freedom. The translation movement, with its careful attention to philosophical nuance and fidelity to Nietzsche's voice, made Nietzsche accessible to a new generation of readers who would not have otherwise found him approachable. The second anecdote concerns the broader European reception, especially the French and German intellectual milieus, where Nietzsche's influence was mediated by a range of thinkers who reinterpreted his emphasis on power, difference, and critique of modernity. The French reception, with its willingness to engage Nietzsche's skepticism through a philosophy of difference and critique of totalizing systems, helped to shape what we now call postmodern thought. The German reception, by contrast, has often sought the more robust, sometimes harsher, interpretations of Nietzsche as a critic of conventional morality, and as a writer whose rhetoric could be appropriated in ways that both widen and threaten intellectual horizons. These historical currents remind us that Nietzsche's ideas are not stable, fixed objects but living, contested interlocutors with whom scholars, writers, and readers continue to argue, revise, and apply in ways that reflect their own concerns. Cross-references finally push Nietzsche into a broader philosophical conversation that is continuous with both ancient and contemporary thought. In existentialism, Sartre's insistence on radical freedom and responsibility resonates with Nietzsche's call to create value through courageous self-creation. Camus's insistence on revolt and meaning in a world without given answers parallels Nietzsche's insistence that life demands a stance of courage and affirmation, even in the face of meaninglessness, even as Nietzsche's rhetoric often challenges Camus's optimism. In post-structuralism, Foucault and Derrida push Nietzsche to the edge of how truth is constructed and how power works in shaping what we take as knowledge. Foucault's historical sensibilities align with Nietzsche's genealogical method, even as Foucault's own investigations take different directions. Derrida's insistence on the play of signification and the instability of meaning resonates with Nietzsche's suspicion that every claim to truth rides on a set of conditions that can be changed. In cognitive science and moral psychology, the questions of belief formation, moral intuition, and cognitive biases echo Nietzsche's interest in how personal and cultural forces shape our values, how stories function as cognitive instruments, and how the will to power operates in both the mental and social spheres. By reading Nietzsche in dialogue with these streams, we encounter a living, dynamic tradition rather than a dusty, closed syllabus. A realistic map of Nietzsche's major works, kept in view as a living guide rather than a fixed curriculum, provides a practical tool for modern readers and scriptwriters who seek to present Nietzsche with nuance. The map begins with the birth of tragedy as a hinge between philosophy and art, where a crisis of culture argument begins to take its shape. Then comes the gay science, a book of mood and insight, and a testing ground for his method of aphoristic inquiry. Then the narrative and allegory of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, with its extraordinary energy and its insistence that becoming is the core of value. Yes to risk, yes to transformation, no to comfortable certainties. From Zarathustra we move to Beyond Good and Evil, a more formal, critical attempt to overthrow conventional morality and reconstruct a new set of standards that can sustain life. Genealogy of Morals then asks where those moral values originated, what interests they serve, and how historical processes shape our current sense of obligation and guilt. Ex Homo and the Antichrist provide a controversial, highly personal counterpoint, Nietzsche's self-portrait and sharp critique of Christian morality. Twilight of the Idols and The Birth of Tragedy bookend the project by offering a late critique of modern culture and a reaffirmation of art, life, and vitality as the core stakes of philosophy. The major works taken together do not present a single manifesto, but a continuous line of questioning that travels from art to life, from the origins of value to the ethical life of the present, always asking whether we are prepared to become someone different in making something new of our own existence. To end with a practice, let us consider two concrete examples of reading sequences that a reader might actually adopt in the coming weeks. Example 1 would begin with the gay science, then read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, followed by Beyond Good and Evil, and finally Genealogy of Morals. This sequence invites the reader to sense Nietzsche's mood and to experience his provocative energy first, then to engage with his narrative exploration of becoming, then to test the moral critique with a more formal philosophical argument, and finally to examine the historical roots of our moral categories. Example 2 would start with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, move to the Genealogy of Morals, then to Beyond Good and Evil, and then to Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist. This order foregrounds Nietzsche's moral critique, then his historical method, and finally his broader cultural critique and personal voice. Each path offers a different flavor of Nietzsche. One emphasizes the existential drama and the invitation to self-overcoming. The other foregrounds the genealogical critique and the cultural critique, yet both paths converge on the same task, to ask what it would be to live more honestly, with greater courage, and with a more inventive sense of what counts as value. In thinking through real-world applications, we can identify several practical practices that align with Nietzsche's spirit, each designed to resist misreadings and to cultivate a thoughtful, living encounter with his thought. One practice is to engage reading as a disciplined act of revision rather than a one-off encounter with a memorable line. Read a paragraph, paraphrase it in your own words, test the idea against a few counterarguments, and then see how Nietzsche's sentence shifts when placed in conversation with the surrounding material. A second practice is to keep a reading journal that traces not only what Nietzsche says, but how the text makes one think differently about belief, value, and motive. Note whether you are responding to a lyric moment, a historical diagnosis, or a normative claim, and track how the genre and rhetorical form shape what you take away. A third practice is to balance literary, historical, and philosophical insights by reading a passage closely for its style and metaphor, then stepping back to consider its historical context, and finally asking whether its argument holds up to critical scrutiny. A fourth practice is to be mindful of translation and editorial history. Compare Kaufman's or Hollingdale's English renderings with others if possible, and examine how a specific translation affects nuance, whether it clarifies a difficult term or obscures a subtle shade of meaning. These practices can transform Nietzsche from an intimidating symbol of rebellion into a living, instructive voice that invites reflection and careful judgment. To integrate Nietzsche into a broader intellectual ecology, it is helpful to draw analogies that illuminate how his thinking operates. One useful analogy is to think of Nietzsche as a craftsman who sharpens many different tools for thinking, rather than a single sculptor who carves one statue. He produces tools for insights into art, psychology, history, and moral critique, and the job of the reader is to learn how to use each tool in the appropriate moment. A second analogy is to imagine Nietzsche as a navigator who teaches us to read the weather of a culture, to assess the currents of power and desire that push human beings towards certain kinds of action, and to recognize that weather, currents, and direction may shift with time and circumstance. A third analogy is to adopt a performer's stance. Nietzsche's writing asks us to listen for the manner in which an argument is presented, to track the tone and tempo of his sentences, to notice when rhetoric moves us toward affirmation and when it challenges us to rethink what we claim to know. Throughout this extended reflection, 2 lines from Nietzsche stand as reminders of the practical aim of living thoughtfully. The first is a prompt about the stakes of belief and the courage to live without surrendering to the comfort of familiar explanations. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. This line, read with attention, does not celebrate atheism as a political program, but questions the moral and existential consequences of a culture that has outgrown its old source of meaning. It asks us to consider what it would take to recreate meaning with vigilance, integrity, and creative energy. The second line, a line of resilience rather than resignation, comes from the more intimate voice of his later reflections. What does not kill me makes me stronger. This line is not a blanket endorsement of adversity for its own sake, but a recognition that human beings grow through struggle, that growth requires a willingness to endure, to reflect, and to transform. If we hold these lines with care, they become not slogans but invitations into a life that is more awake, more inventive, and more responsible to itself and to others. And yet we must not pretend that Nietzsche offers a program or a guarantee for living well. He offers an invitation to a sustained practice of thinking, a discipline of self-examination that can cultivate a form of life capable of enduring uncertainty, resisting simplistic answers, and remaining open to the mystery of human motivation. The living thought he demands is not a static doctrine, but a dynamic art, an art of becoming that recognizes the contingency of human affairs, the complexity of motives, and the perpetual need to recheck the grounds of our beliefs and commitments. In a world where information and opinion move at speed and where values can spin with the momentum of social media and political rhetoric, Nietzsche's insistence on critical reading, on questioning the most dear convictions, on resisting the seductions of dogmatism, remains profoundly relevant. The call to live thoughtfully, amor fati, the love of fate, even in its most difficult forms, appears in a form that invites not cynicism but a deeper engagement with life's challenges, a willingness to create meaning with fullness and responsibility. As you move forward with Nietzsche, may your practice be patient, attentive, and generous to yourself and to others. May you learn to distinguish the different voices in his work, the aphoristic bursts, the poetic parables, the historical analyses, the ethical critiques, and may you resist the temptations to flatten his thought into a single line of reasoning. May you also be mindful of your own context, the translations you use, the edition you read, the conversations you share, and the aims you pursue in presenting his ideas. In the end, to read Nietzsche well is not to become a disciple of a doctrine, but to become a more thoughtful reader of life itself. To test, to question, to dream, and to keep living with the question, what does it mean to live a good life in a world that will not hand us a ready answer? If you approach him with patience, a sense of historical awareness, and a readiness to be challenged, Nietzsche will not merely surprise you. He will also become a partner in your own ongoing effort to thrive with clarity, courage, and care for what matters most.